What if everything you thought you knew about the Aztecs was merely a shadow of the truth, a carefully constructed narrative designed to hide the most terrifying and profound aspects of their cosmology? Beneath the pyramids of Tenochtitlan, beyond the pages of sanitized history books, lies a mythology so dark and complex that conquistadors chose to bury it rather than comprehend it. The gods they worshipped were not benevolent creators watching from distant heavens, but beings who demanded blood, who walked among mortals in forms both beautiful and grotesque, who understood that creation and destruction were merely two faces of the same cosmic truth. Tonight we descend into those forgotten shadows, where the real story waits with obsidian eyes and a hunger that spans centuries. The Spanish arrived in 1519 with crosses and swords, finding a civilization that terrified them in ways they could barely articulate. They saw the Tzompantli, the massive racks of skulls that lined the ceremonial plaza, and counted tens of thousands of human remains displayed like macabre trophies. They witnessed priests wearing the flayed skins of sacrificial victims, blood running down the steps of pyramids in rivers that seemed to flow endlessly. What they could not understand, what their minds refused to accept, was that these acts were not barbarism, but sacred duty, a cosmic transaction that kept the sun rising and the world spinning on its axis. The Aztecs believed they lived in the fifth and final age of creation, an age destined to end in catastrophic earthquakes unless the gods received constant nourishment through sacrifice. This was not cruelty but survival, not darkness but the deepest form of devotion imaginable. Before we journey deeper into these hidden realms, I want to invite you to become part of this exploration. If you're fascinated by the mysteries that history tried to erase, by the myths that still whisper from ancient stones, then subscribe to Boring Bedtime Stories. We're building a community of seekers, those who refuse to accept simplified versions of the past, who understand that the most profound truths often hide in the shadows we're taught to fear. Click that subscribe button and join us as we uncover the secrets they never wanted you to know. Now, before we continue this descent into the Aztec underworld, I'm curious about you. Leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from tonight and whether you've ever felt the pull of these ancient mysteries in your own life. Are you in Mexico City, walking the same streets where Tenochtitlan once stood? Or are you halfway across the world, connected to these stories by something deeper than geography? Share your thoughts, because this journey is one we take together. The mythology we're about to explore exists in fragments, pieced together from codices that survived the fires, from temple walls that spoke in stone when voices were silenced, from oral traditions that refused to die even when empires fell. The Aztecs called themselves the Mexica, inheritors of a prophetic vision that led them to an island in Lake Texcoco where an eagle devoured a serpent atop a cactus. There, they built not just a city, but a cosmic axis, a place where the boundaries between mortal and divine, between earth and underworld, between order and chaos, grew thin enough to cross. Tenochtitlan was never merely a capital, it was a living temple, every street and canal designed according to cosmological principles that mapped the structure of the universe itself. To walk through the city was to walk through the body of creation, and to understand the city was to understand the of reality as the Mexica perceived it. But the city that dazzled Cortés and his men, with its floating gardens and massive pyramids, its bustling markets and sophisticated aqueducts, was only the visible surface. Beneath it lay another realm, one that existed simultaneously in physical space and spiritual dimension. The Templo Mayor, the great pyramid at the city's heart, was not a single structure, but 7 nested temples, each built over the previous one, like layers of an onion, each containing the history and power of the rulers who constructed it. When Spanish soldiers demolished the final version, they unknowingly preserved the earlier temples beneath, creating an archaeological palimpsest where the past survived in hidden layers. This architecture of concealment and revelation mirrors the mythology itself, where every god contained multitudes, where every symbol carried meanings within meanings, where nothing was ever exactly as it appeared. The gods of this hidden pantheon were not the simplified figures often presented in textbooks, the feathered serpent and the rain deity stripped of their complexity and terror. They were shapeshifters and tricksters, creators and destroyers, beings who could be simultaneously male and female, young and ancient, benevolent and malevolent. Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, could appear as a beautiful youth or a skeletal horror, could grant kingship or madness with equal indifference. Coatlicue, the serpent-skirted mother of gods, wore a necklace of human hearts and hands, her body a writhing mass of serpents that both repulsed and fascinated those who beheld her image. These were not gods who demanded worship from a distance, but entities who intervened directly in human affairs, who could be encountered at crossroads, in dreams, in the visions induced by sacred mushrooms and morning glory seeds. The boundary between human and divine was permeable, dangerous, pregnant with possibility and terror. What the conquistadors witnessed and recorded was real, but their interpretation was filtered through a worldview that could not comprehend the Aztec cosmos. They saw human sacrifice and called it evil, never understanding that to the Mexica, sacrifice was the highest honor, the most profound act of reciprocity with the forces that sustained existence. The warriors captured in the ritual flower wars, the children offered to Tlaloc on mountaintops, the priests who drew blood from their own tongues and earlobes daily, were all participants in a cosmic economy where life fed life, where death was the currency that purchased the continued survival of the world. The Aztecs did not fear death as an ending, but understood it as a transformation, a necessary passage that made renewal possible. The skulls on the Tzompantli were not trophies of conquest, but seeds of regeneration, physical reminders that from death comes life, that the cycle never truly ends. Yet even within Aztec culture, there were secrets within secrets, mysteries known only to the initiated few. The priests who served Mictlantecutli, the skeletal lord of the underworld, possessed knowledge about the journey through the 9 levels of Mictlan that was never recorded in surviving codices. The shamans who could transform into their Nahual forms, becoming jaguars or eagles or serpents at will, guarded techniques passed down through generations of oral tradition. The women who died in childbirth and became the Chihuateteo, powerful spirits who haunted crossroads, were honored in ceremonies whose details have been lost to time. These hidden layers of belief and practice created a mythology far more complex and nuanced than what Spanish chroniclers chose to preserve. The real tragedy of the conquest was not just the destruction of temples and the death of millions from disease and warfare, but the systematic erasure of a complete cosmological system. Franciscan friars gathered codices and burned them, believing they were destroying works of the devil rather than preserving human knowledge. Indigenous nobles who tried to maintain the old ways were executed as idolaters. Languages that contained concepts with no European equivalents were suppressed and forgotten. What survived did so in fragments, in syncretic practices where ancient gods wore Christian masks, in place names and folk tales where the old beliefs hibernated, waiting. The mythology we can access today is like a shattered mosaic where crucial pieces are missing, where we can glimpse the pattern but never see it whole. This is why we must approach these stories not as dead relics of a vanished past, but as living traditions that continue to shape culture and consciousness. The legends of La Llorona and El Chupacabra, the celebrations of Dia de los Muertos, the persistent belief in naguals and spiritual forces that permeate Mexican folklore, all carry genetic traces of the Aztec worldview. The gods may have new names and faces, but the fundamental understanding that reality contains unseen dimensions, that death is not an ending, that sacrifice and suffering have cosmic significance, these beliefs persist. To study Aztec mythology is not merely to learn about history, but to encounter a radically different way of understanding existence, one that challenges our assumptions about life, death, meaning, and the of the divine. As we begin this journey together through the hidden corners of Aztec belief, prepare yourself for stories that will disturb and fascinate in equal measure. We will meet gods who demand terrible prices, creatures who haunt the boundaries between worlds, souls who undergo trials that test the very essence of their being. We will explore why the Aztecs feared the night sky, why they believed our world could end at any moment, why they understood that beauty and horror are inseparable. These are not comfortable stories, not myths sanitized for mass consumption, but the raw, powerful, terrifying truths that shaped one of history's most sophisticated and misunderstood civilizations. The whispers from Tenochtitlan's shadows are calling. Will you have the courage to listen? In the deepest chamber of the underworld, where no sunlight has ever penetrated and no living breath has ever warmed the air, sits a throne carved from obsidian and bone. Upon this throne rests a figure that embodies the ultimate truth all mortals must face, a deity whose very existence reminds us that death is not the opposite of life, but its inevitable companion. His name is Mictlantecutli, Lord of Mictlan, and his skeletal grin has watched empires rise and fall, has witnessed every soul that ever walked the earth eventually descend into his domain. While Spanish chroniclers mentioned him briefly before moving on to gods they found less disturbing, the Mexica knew him intimately, feared him profoundly, and honored him with ceremonies so dark that their details were deliberately obscured from historical record. Mictlantecutli's appearance was designed to strip away all illusions about mortalities. His body was skeletal, often depicted with exposed ribs and joints, his liver hanging visibly outside his body as a reminder that death reveals all hidden things. His face was a skull, sometimes adorned with curly black hair, his jaw perpetually open in what could be interpreted as either a scream or a laugh, that ambiguous expression capturing the duel of death itself. He wore a crown made from human bones, and his body was sometimes covered in spots representing stars, linking him to the night sky and the cosmic order. His hands ended in claws capable of tearing through flesh and grasping souls, and his eyes were depicted as empty sockets that somehow still saw everything, missed nothing, forgot no one. This was not a god of gentle transitions or peaceful rest, but a sovereign whose realm demanded tribute and whose hunger was insatiable. The Mexica gave him other names that revealed different aspects of his. They called him Ixpustec, meaning broken face, acknowledging the decomposition that awaits all flesh. They named him Nextepehua, the scatterer of ashes, recognizing his role in the ultimate dissolution of physical form. They whispered his title Tzontemoc, he who lowers his head, perhaps referring to the bowing posture of death or the descent into the earth that all bodies must make. Each name was a prayer and a recognition, an acknowledgement that this god's dominion was absolute and unavoidable, that every living thing existed only temporarily outside his grasp. Mictlantecutli ruled Mictlan not in isolation, but alongside his consort Mictecacihuatl, the Lady of the Dead, creating a divine partnership that mirrored earthly marriage while transcending it. Together they presided over the ninth and deepest level of the underworld, where souls finally arrived after their 4-year journey through trials and torments. Their palace was described in fragments of surviving texts as a place of perpetual darkness, where the air was thick with the smell of decay and the sounds of weeping echoed through endless corridors. Yet this was not conceived as punishment for sin, not a hell in the Christian sense, but simply the natural destination for most of humanity. The Mexica understanding of the afterlife was not moral, but circumstantial. Where your soul went depended not on how virtuously you lived, but on how you died. The creation myths reveal just how essential Mictlantecutli was to the cosmic order, how even the gods themselves could not bypass his authority. When the fourth sun ended in a catastrophic flood and humanity needed to be recreated for the fifth age, it was Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, who descended into Mictlan to retrieve the bones of the previous humans. He approached Mictlantecutli and asked permission to take these bones to the surface world, where they would be ground into powder and mixed with divine blood to create a new human race. The Lord of Death, suspicious and possessive of everything in his domain, agreed but set a condition. Quetzalcoatl must travel around Mictlan 4 times while blowing a conch shell trumpet. What Mictlantecutli gave him was not a real conch, but a shell with no holes, an impossible task designed to trap the god in the underworld forever. Quetzalcoatl, clever and desperate, called upon worms to drill holes in the shell and bees to fly inside and make it sound. The music of life echoed through the realm of death, and Mictlantecutli was forced to honor his word. But the Lord of the Dead is not easily deceived without consequence. As Quetzalcoatl fled with the precious bones, Mictlantecutli commanded his servants to dig a pit, and the feathered serpent fell into it, scattering and breaking the bones. Quetzalcoatl gathered what he could and escaped, but because the bones were broken and incomplete, the humans created from them were imperfect, varied in size and ability, mortal and fragile. This myth teaches that even in defeat, Mictlantecutli shaped humanity, that death's mark is on us from the moment of creation, that we carry the underworld in our very bones. The worship of Mictlantecutli involved practices that revealed just how seriously the Mexica took their relationship with death. During the month of Tititl, which fell roughly in December, ceremonies intensified at the temple called Tlalxico, the navel of the world, a site considered to be an access point between the realms of the living and the dead. An impersonator would be chosen, someone who would dress as the god himself, painting their body to resemble a skeleton, wearing the ceremonial regalia associated with Mictlantecutli. This person would be treated with reverence and honor, given special foods and privileges, because they had become a living incarnation of the divine. Then, at the ceremony's climax, they would be sacrificed at night, when Mictlantecutli's power was strongest, and their flesh would be consumed in a ritual that bound the community to the underworld's lord. This practice of ritual cannibalism, so disturbing to Spanish sensibilities, was not viewed by the Mexica as barbarism, but as communion, a literal incorporation of divine essence into human bodies. By consuming the flesh of someone who had been transformed into Mictlantecutli's earthly vessel, participants believed they were acknowledging their eventual return to the underworld, making peace with their mortality and establishing a reciprocal relationship with death itself. The god fed on humanity through sacrifice, and humanity fed on the god through consumption, creating a cycle that mirrored the larger cosmic patterns of destruction and renewal. Throughout the ceremony, incense burned constantly, its smoke carrying prayers and offerings upward, even as they honored the deity of the depths below. Mictlantecutli's sacred associations reveal the Mexica understanding of death's connection to specific animals and directions. He was linked to owls, those nocturnal birds whose calls were considered omens of approaching death, whose ability to see in darkness mirrored the god's perception in the lightless underworld. Spiders, too, were his creatures, weaving webs that caught souls as they descended, their patient waiting reflecting death's certainty. Bats, emerging at dusk to feed, existed in the liminal space between day and night, life and death, and thus belonged to Mictlantecutli's domain. The direction of the north, specifically the northern deserts where nothing grew and the sun beat down mercilessly on barren earth, was considered the gateway to Mictlan. To travel north was to approach death's territory, to enter lands where the boundary between worlds grew thin. What makes Mictlantecutli particularly fascinating in the broader context of death deities across cultures is his complete lack of moral judgment. Unlike the Egyptian weighing of the heart or the Christian judgment of souls, Mictlantecutli did not care whether you were virtuous or wicked, generous or cruel, brave or cowardly. He simply waited with absolute patience for every soul that was not claimed by other realms. Warriors who died in battle went to the paradise of the sun god. Women who died in childbirth joined them as honored equals. Those who drowned belonged to Tlaloc's watery paradise, and victims of certain diseases had their own special afterlife. But everyone else, the vast majority of humanity who died ordinary deaths of age or illness or accident, belonged to Mictlantecutli. In this way, the Mexica cosmology suggested that death was the great equalizer, that earthly status and accomplishments meant nothing in the face of the underworld's democracy. Yet even in his terrifying aspect, even in the darkness of his domain and the horror of his skeletal form, Mictlantecutli represented something essential and even necessary to the cosmic order. Without death, there could be no renewal, no space for new life, no transformation from one state to another. He was the keeper of bones that would become the foundation of future creation, the guardian of endings that made new beginnings possible. The Mexica did not worship him out of love, but out of recognition that his role was as vital as any creator deity's, that destruction and creation were inseparable forces requiring equal acknowledgement. When Moctezuma II faced the Spanish arrival and feared the end of the world, he increased sacrifices to Mictlantecutli not to avoid death, but to ensure that when the apocalypse came, the transition would be managed by the proper cosmic authority. This skeletal lord continues to cast his shadow over Mexican culture even centuries after his temples fell. The elaborate celebrations of Dia de los Muertos, where families build altars to deceased loved ones and decorate graves with marigolds and sugar skulls, carry echoes of the old worship, the old understanding that death is not an enemy to be defeated, but a reality to be honored and integrated into life. The skeleton figures that dance in folk art, dressed in fancy clothes and engage in everyday activities, reflect Mictlantecutli's lesson that death walks among us always, that the living and the dead exist in constant relationship. His forgotten name may not be spoken in these modern rituals, but his presence remains, that ancient skeletal grin still reminding us that mortality is not humanity's weakness, but its defining truth, not a curse, but a cosmic constant that shapes everything we are and everything we can become. Death was not the end for the Mexica, but a beginning, the first step of a journey so arduous that it made earthly suffering seem trivial by comparison. When a person died an ordinary death, not claimed by the sun through warfare or by Tlaloc through drowning, their soul faced a 4-year odyssey through 9 increasingly difficult levels of Mictlan, each designed to strip away the attachments of physical existence and transform the essence of who they had been. This was not punishment for sins committed, but a universal trial, a necessary passage that every common soul must undertake regardless of their earthly virtue or wickedness. The journey began immediately upon death, and the living prepared their deceased loved ones with ritual items and offerings, knowing that what they placed in the grave would become spiritual tools in the trials ahead. The first level was called Apanahuaya, the place of crossing the water, where souls encountered a vast river that separated the living world from the realm of the dead. This was no gentle stream, but a raging torrent whose waters were said to flow in opposing directions simultaneously, creating currents that pulled souls beneath the surface and threatened to drown them eternally in the liminal space between life and death. The deceased could not swim across this river alone. They required assistance from a creature who waited on the near shore, a small reddish-brown dog known as a Xoloitzcuintli. This was why the Mexica often buried these dogs with their dead or included ceramic representations of them in tombs, knowing that without this faithful companion, a soul would wander the riverbank forever, unable to proceed. The dog would recognize its master and carry them across, but only if the deceased had treated animals with kindness in life, revealing that even in a cosmology without moral judgment, certain karmic principles operated subtly beneath the surface. Once across the river, the soul entered Tepectli Naucampa, the place where the hills meet, the second level, where 2 massive mountains continually crash together with earth-shattering force. These peaks were not merely obstacles, but living entities, perhaps gods themselves, locked in an eternal cycle of collision and separation that created moments of deadly calm, followed by devastating impact. The soul had to time their passage perfectly, waiting for the instant when the mountains pulled apart, then rushing through the gap before they smashed together again. Those who miscalculated were crushed flat, their spiritual essence squeezed and compacted, though they could not truly die again. Instead, they experienced the agony of annihilation repeatedly until they finally learned patience, timing, and the courage to move, when movement meant the difference between progress and eternal suffering. This trial taught that advancement often requires waiting for the right moment rather than charging forward recklessly, that wisdom involves knowing when to act and when to remain still. The third level was Iztapetl, the mountain of obsidian blades, where a massive peak rose before the soul, its slopes covered entirely in sharp volcanic glass that cut through spiritual flesh as easily as it once cut through physical skin. There was no path around this mountain. The only way forward was upward, climbing through forests of obsidian shards that sliced hands and feet with every movement, leaving trails of ghostly blood that evaporated into the cold air. The Mexica knew obsidian well, used it for their weapons and sacrificial knives, understood its properties intimately. To encounter it here meant facing the instrument of their civilization's greatest rituals, in a context where they were no longer the ones wielding the blade, but the ones being cut. The climb seemed endless, and with each step upward, the shards grew sharper, the air grew thinner, until finally the soul reached the summit and could descend the far side, bearing the scars of ascent as permanent markings of their determination. The fourth level brought a different kind of torment. Itzehekayan, the place of the obsidian wind, where a cold gale howled eternally with such force that it carried millions of tiny obsidian fragments suspended in its currents. This wind was not merely cold, but supernaturally freezing, carrying with it the chill of absolute zero, the temperature of spaces where no warmth has ever existed and no life can survive. The obsidian particles acted like microscopic knives, flaying the soul slowly as they passed through this realm, stripping away layer after layer of whatever remained of their earthly identity. The deceased had to walk bent against the wind, making slow progress while being simultaneously frozen and cut, their essence gradually worn down by the relentless assault. Those who had lived with attachment to their physical appearance, who had valued beauty or strength or youth, found this trial particularly agonizing as the wind and blades erased all traces of what they had been, revealing the core essence beneath the superficial exterior. Level 5 was known as Panyakatakoyan, the place where bodies float like banners. And here the geography shifted into something incomprehensible by earthly standards. In this realm, the laws of gravity seemed suspended or reversed, and souls found themselves floating helplessly through a void where no solid ground existed, where direction lost all meaning, where up and down became interchangeable concepts. They drifted like flags in an invisible current, unable to control their movement, at the mercy of forces they could neither see nor understand. The terror of this level came from the absolute loss of agency, the recognition that control was an illusion that persisted only in the realm of the living. Some souls floated for what seemed like centuries before finally descending to the next level, learning through their helpless drifting that surrender was sometimes the only form of movement available. The sixth level, Temiminaloyan, the place where people are pierced with arrows, presented a different challenge entirely. Here the path narrowed to a single road, flanked on both sides by invisible archers who shot arrows continuously at passing souls. The projectiles came from all angles without warning, piercing spiritual flesh with agonizing accuracy, and the soul had to navigate this gauntlet while dodging attacks they could not predict. The god Temiminatakutli, Lord of Archers, presided over this realm, his servants firing endlessly from concealment. There was no strategy to avoid all the arrows. Injury was inevitable. The trial tested not whether the soul could pass unscathed, but whether they could continue moving forward despite the wounds accumulating in their essence, whether pain would paralyze them, or if they possessed the determination to keep walking, even when every step brought fresh agony. In the seventh level, Teokoyohuehualoyan, the place where wild beasts devour hearts, the deceased encountered creatures unlike any that walked the earth. These were not natural animals, but spiritual predators, jaguars with eyes that burned like coals, serpents whose scales reflected no light, eagles whose talons could tear through the fabric of souls themselves. These beasts existed in the underworld specifically to test the courage of the dead, to see if fear could still dominate those who had already faced death itself. The beasts would attack, tearing at the chest to reach the spiritual heart, the core of memory and identity that remained after physical death. Some souls were devoured completely, their hearts consumed, and yet they reformed, forced to face the beasts again and again, until they learned to walk through the hunting grounds without fleeing, without allowing terror to control their actions. This trial revealed that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite its presence. The 8th level was called Izmictlan Apokalolka, the place of mist or the place of flints, and accounts of its exact varied even among Mexica sources, suggesting that this level appeared differently to different souls based on what they most feared or most needed to confront. Some described it as a realm of perpetual fog, where visibility extended barely beyond one's outstretched hands, where souls wandered disoriented and lost, unable to find the path forward. Others spoke of rooms surrounded by flint knives that gnashed like teeth, trying to devour those who entered. The common element was disorientation and the feeling of being consumed, of losing the thread of purpose that had carried the soul through the previous 7 trials. Here, many souls gave up, sitting down in the mist or cowering from the flints, unable to remember why they continued forward or where they were ultimately going. Only those who maintained their determination despite losing sight of their destination eventually stumbled through to the final level. Finally, after 4 years of continuous trials, after crossing rivers and climbing mountains, after being cut and frozen and shot and devoured and lost, the soul arrived at Chikunamictlan, the 9th place of the dead, the realm where Mictlantecutli and Mictecacihuatl sat upon their throne of bones. This was the ultimate destination, the place of rest where the journey finally ended. But this rest was not peaceful sleep or heavenly paradise. It was dissolution, the gradual fading of individual consciousness back into the cosmic pool of spiritual energy. The Mexica sources say that here the dead finally perished, vanished, ceased to exist as distinct entities. Yet this ending was also a beginning, because the bones and essence of the dead would eventually be recycled, used by the gods to create new life, just as Quetzalcoatl had once used the bones from Mictlan to create humanity. Death fed life, and life fed death, in an eternal cycle that these 9 trials prepared the soul to understand and accept. The families of the deceased marked the passage through these levels with ceremonies performed at specific intervals after death. Offerings were made 80 days after the funeral, then after 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and finally 4 years, each ceremony intended to provide spiritual sustenance to the soul as they struggled through the trials. These rituals acknowledged that death was not an instantaneous transition, but a process, a journey that required support from the living. The souls were not gone, but traveling, and the living maintained connection with them through these repeated acts of remembrance and offering. This practice revealed the Mexica understanding that the boundary between life and death was not absolute, but permeable, that the dead remained in relationship with the living for years after their bodies had been placed in the earth, and that love could cross even the barriers of Mictlan's 9 horrific levels, providing strength to souls who walked through darkness toward their ultimate transformation. Look up at the night sky on a clear evening, and you will see what most people interpret as beauty, the twinkling of distant stars, the serene darkness punctuated by points of light that have inspired poetry and romance for millennia. But the Mexica saw something entirely different when they gazed upward after sunset. They saw weapons poised to strike, skeletal goddesses waiting with infinite patience for the moment when the cosmic order would falter, when the sun would weaken enough for them to descend and tear apart the fabric of reality itself. These were the Tzitzimime, the star demons, and they represented the most terrifying truth in the Aztec cosmology. That existence itself hung by a thread, that the forces of destruction perpetually outnumbered the forces of creation, and that only constant vigilance and sacrifice kept the darkness from devouring everything that lived and breathed and moved beneath the sky. The name Tzitzimime comes from the Nahuatl word meaning to fall violently from above or to strike down from the sky. They were not singular but plural, a host of female deities who dwelt in the celestial realm, specifically in the regions where day transitions to night and night transitions to day, those liminal spaces where boundaries grow thin and order gives way to chaos. Spanish chroniclers, who recorded fragments of Aztec belief, struggled to comprehend these entities, sometimes calling them demons, sometimes stars, sometimes spirits, never quite grasping that in the Mexica worldview, these categories were not mutually exclusive, but overlapping aspects of the same terrifying reality. The Tzitzimime were all of these things simultaneously: divine, demonic, celestial, destructive, and absolutely essential to understanding how the cosmos functioned. Physically, the Tzitzimime were depicted as skeletal women with clawed hands and feet, their bones exposed in detailed anatomical accuracy that showed the Mexica intimate familiarity with death and decomposition. Their faces were skulls, sometimes adorned with elaborate headdresses that marked their divine status, their jaws hanging open in perpetual hunger. They wore skirts made from intertwined serpents or human bones, and their bodies were sometimes covered with stars or symbols of night, marking them as creatures of darkness and celestial spaces. In some representations, they appeared with exposed hearts or with intestines spilling from their abdominal cavities, visceral reminders of mortality and the violence that lurked at the edges of cosmic order. Their hands often held weapons, curved blades or obsidian knives, though the Tzitzimime themselves were the true weapons, their entire beings instruments of divine destruction. The Tzitzimime were not evil in any moral sense, not demons who rebelled against good or chose wickedness over virtue. They were cosmic forces, aspects of the universe as necessary and inevitable as gravity or time, embodiments of the principle that all created things must eventually be destroyed so that new creation can occur. They existed as a perpetual threat, a constant pressure against the walls of ordered reality, waiting for any moment of weakness, any gap in the cosmic defenses that kept chaos at bay. The sun, Tonatiuh, engaged in daily battle to rise each morning and cross the sky, and every journey weakened him slightly, made him more vulnerable to the forces that sought his destruction. The Tzitzimime watched and waited, their skeletal forms poised at the boundaries of the world, ready to descend the moment the sun faltered. Eclipses were the moments of greatest terror, when the sun was actively being devoured by cosmic forces, when the barrier between order and chaos grew thin enough that the Tzitzimime might break through. During solar eclipses, the Mexica believed the star demons descended closer to Earth, testing the boundaries, searching for weaknesses. These were times of desperate ritual activity, when priests and common people alike would engage in bloodletting and sacrifice, offering their own life essence to strengthen the sun and push back the encroaching darkness. Pregnant women were considered especially vulnerable during eclipses, as the Tzitzimime were believed to be capable of transforming unborn children into mice or deforming them, marking them with a touch of chaos. Women would stay indoors with obsidian blades tucked into their clothing as protection, symbols of the very substance that could cut through the fabric of reality and therefore perhaps defend against entities that existed at reality's edges. The end of each 52-year calendar cycle brought even greater fear, as this was when the entire cosmic order hung in the balance. The Mexica called this the New Fire Ceremony, and it involved extinguishing every fire in the empire, plunging the civilization into complete darkness for one night, while priests climbed to the summit of a sacred mountain to perform the most critical ritual in their religious calendar. At midnight, as specific star clusters reached their zenith, the priests would perform a human sacrifice and attempt to light a new fire in the chest cavity of the victim. If the fire caught, if the flames rose successfully, it meant the sun would rise again and the world would continue for another 52 years. But if the fire failed, if the darkness refused to give birth to light, then the Tzitzimime would descend in their full terrible glory. The stars themselves would fall from the sky, and they would devour all of humanity, ending the fifth sun and plunging the cosmos into eternal night. Imagine the terror of standing in complete darkness, knowing that your entire civilization had extinguished every flame, that no light existed anywhere in the world you knew, and that cosmic forces of unimaginable power were deciding whether existence itself would continue. Every citizen stayed awake through that night, watching the mountaintop where the ceremony occurred, waiting for the sight of flames being carried down by runners, the signal that the world had been granted another cycle. Pregnant women were hidden in granaries, as the Tsitsimimi were believed to be particularly interested in consuming those who carried new life. Children were kept awake by any means necessary, pinched and prodded, because to sleep during this night was to risk transformation, to risk being claimed by the forces of chaos that pressed so heavily against reality's boundaries. The psychological weight of this belief, the genuine fear that the sun might not rise and that skeletal star goddesses might descend to tear apart everything and everyone, shaped Aztec culture in profound ways that purely rational analysis can never fully capture. Yet the Tsitsimimi were not purely destructive forces to be feared without nuance or complexity. Some of them had names and individual identities, personalities that revealed the Mexica understanding that even cosmic destruction contained multiplicity and variation. Its papalotl, the obsidian butterfly, was one of the most prominent Tsitsimime, a goddess associated with sacrifice and war who could appear as a beautiful woman or transform into her true skeletal form with butterfly wings edged in obsidian blades. Chihuahuatl, the serpent woman, we will explore more deeply in a later chapter, had connections to the Tsitsimime through her associations with death and prophecy. Tlaltecutli, the earth monster, shared characteristics with them, that skeletal hunger and primordial danger. These named Tsitsimime sometimes received worship and offerings, suggesting that the Mexica understood they could be appeased or perhaps temporarily aligned with human interests, that cosmic forces could be negotiated with, even if they could never be fully controlled. The connection between the Tsitsimime and women who died in childbirth reveals another layer of complexity in Aztec cosmology. Women who died bringing new life into the world were believed to become Cihuateteo, powerful spirits who existed in a liminal space between human and divine, between life-giving and life-taking. Some sources suggest these Cihuateteo were considered a subset or close relation to the Tsitsimime, sharing their skeletal appearance and their association with specific dangerous times and places. They would descend to Earth on certain calendar days, haunting crossroads and causing madness or illness in children they encountered. This association between maternal death and cosmic destruction, between the most intimate act of creation and the largest forces of annihilation, speaks to the Mexica understanding that birth and death, creation and destruction, were not opposites but inseparable aspects of the same fundamental process. The rituals and sacrifices performed to keep the Tsitsimimi at bay were not acts of cruelty, but expressions of cosmic responsibility. The understanding that humanity had a role to play in maintaining the order of existence itself. The Mexica believed they lived in the fifth and final age of creation, that 4 previous worlds had already been destroyed by various catastrophes, and that their world would inevitably end in earthquakes unless they fulfilled their sacred duty. Feeding the sun with human blood and hearts was not barbarism, but the price of continued existence, the payment demanded by the cosmic forces that kept the Tsitsimime and other destructive entities from breaking through and ending everything. Every sacrifice was a negotiation with chaos, a payment made to extend the time before the inevitable collapse. Modern sensibilities recoil from this practice, but understanding it requires grasping the genuine belief that without these acts, the stars would fall and skeletal goddesses would devour the sun. The Tsitsimime persist in Mexican culture even now, though their names and forms have changed. The fear of eclipses, the protective rituals performed by pregnant women during astronomical events, the understanding that darkness contains dangers that transcend the merely physical. These beliefs echo through generations. The calavera images that populate Day of the Dead celebrations, those grinning female skeletons dressed in elaborate clothing, carry genetic traces of the Tsitsimime, transforming cosmic terror into artistic celebration while maintaining the fundamental recognition that death and femininity and celestial forces intertwine in ways both beautiful and terrifying. The star demons wait still at the edges of existence, patient as only cosmic forces can be patient, reminding us that the order we take for granted is fragile, maintained by forces we barely understand, and that the night sky contains not just beauty, but the instruments of our potential destruction. skeletal goddesses whose hunger will someday, inevitably, be satisfied when the fifth sun finally fails and the age of earthquakes begins. Before there was earth beneath your feet, before mountains rose against the horizon or rivers carved their paths through valleys, before anything solid existed upon which life could take root and flourish, there was only water. But this was not the peaceful ocean of creation myths you may have encountered in other traditions, not a calm, primordial sea, awaiting the gentle touch of divine hands to separate and organize its elements. The waters that filled the void before creation were inhabited by something ancient and terrible, a creature whose hunger was so vast and insatiable that it devoured everything that drifted into its domain, a beast whose very existence represented the chaotic forces that opposed all order and structure. Its name was Cipactli, and the world you inhabit today, every mountain and valley, every stone and grain of sand, was once part of its flesh, torn violently from its body in an act of creative destruction that set the pattern for all Aztec cosmology. Cipactli was a monster that defied categorization, a chimera that combined the features of multiple predators into a single nightmarish form. Sources describe it variously as having the head of a crocodile with massive jaws lined with razor teeth, the body of a fish covered in scales that reflected no light, and additional mouths at every joint of its body, so that it could feed in all directions simultaneously without ever ceasing its consumption. Some accounts give it the characteristics of a swordfish or shark, emphasizing its aquatic and predatory essence. Others describe it as a dragon-like entity, serpentine and enormous, coiling through the primordial waters in endless spirals. What all accounts agree upon is that Cipactli was perpetually, insatiably hungry, that its mouths never closed, that it consumed everything within reach and cried out constantly for more, its roars echoing through the emptiness that preceded creation. In the beginning, when the gods looked down from their celestial realm and contemplated the work of creation, they saw this beast swimming through the void and recognized immediately that nothing could be built while it existed. Any earth they tried to form would be devoured. Any life they attempted to create would be consumed before it could take its first breath. Cipactli represented chaos in its purest form, hunger without purpose, destruction without the promise of renewal. Yet the gods also understood something profound, that creation cannot emerge from nothing, that something must be sacrificed and transformed for new forms to arise, that the material of the world must come from somewhere. They looked at Cipactli with its massive body filling the primordial waters, and they conceived a plan both brilliant and brutal, an act that would establish the fundamental pattern of Aztec cosmology, the understanding that beauty and life arise only through violence and sacrifice. Two gods volunteered for this cosmic task: Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent associated with wisdom and wind, and Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror lord of night and chaos. These two deities existed in perpetual opposition and cooperation, rivals and partners, representing complementary forces that together could accomplish what neither could achieve alone. They descended from the heavens and transformed themselves into enormous serpents, taking forms that could grapple with Cipactli in its own element. The battle that followed was not recorded in detail in surviving sources, but we can imagine the cosmic struggle, two divine serpents coiling around the thrashing monster, avoiding its countless mouths, enduring its desperate attempts to devour them as it had devoured everything else. The waters churned and boiled with the violence of their combat, and the void itself trembled as creation hung in the balance. Finally, after a struggle that may have lasted moments or eons in that timeless space before time began, Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca succeeded in their task. They tore Cipactli apart, ripping its body into pieces with savage efficiency. But this was not simple destruction, not killing for the sake of eliminating a threat. This was transformation, the forcible conversion of chaotic matter into ordered form. From Cipactli's massive body, the gods fashioned the earth itself. Its head became the eastern mountains, its tail the western ranges, its spine the central highlands that would one day support great civilizations. Its scales became the stones and rocks scattered across the landscape, Its blood filled the rivers and lakes, and from the cavities of its body came the valleys where humans would eventually build their cities. Every geographic feature of the world, every elevation and depression, every natural formation was once part of this primordial monster's flesh. But Cipactli did not die completely, and this is where the myth becomes particularly significant in understanding Aztec worldview. The earth formed from its body remained partially alive, still hungry, still demanding to be fed. The Mexica believed that the earth goddess Tlaltecutli, often depicted with characteristics similar to Cipactli, including mouths at her joints, was either the same entity or intimately connected to it. The earth devoured the dead, consuming their bodies and returning them to the cycle of existence, just as Cipactli had once consumed everything in the primordial waters. Plants grew from the earth by feeding on corpses and decay, drawing nourishment from death to produce life. This understanding that the ground beneath human feet was constructed from the flesh of a hungering monster, that the world itself was alive and demanded feeding, provided theological justification for the practice of human sacrifice. The earth had to eat just as people had to eat, and denying it nourishment would result in catastrophe. The violence of this creation story stands in stark contrast to myths from other cultures where creation emerges peacefully from divine thought or word. The Aztec cosmos was born in blood and struggle, established through an act of necessary brutality that set precedent for all that followed. Tezcatlipoca lost his foot during the battle with Cipactli, torn off by one of the monster's many mouths, and thereafter the god limped through mythology, his sacrifice marked permanently upon his body. This detail is telling. Even the gods bore the scars of creation. Even divine beings paid a price for bringing order out of chaos. If the gods themselves had to suffer and sacrifice to create the world, how much more must humans be willing to give to maintain it? This logic pervaded Aztec religious thinking, creating a cosmology where reciprocal sacrifice was not optional, but essential to existence itself. The image of Cipactli appears repeatedly in Aztec art and iconography, often as a symbolic representation of the earth or as a decorative element in codices and stone carvings. The famous Aztec calendar stone features Cipactli as the first day sign in the sacred calendar, emphasizing its primordial importance and its connection to beginnings and origins. Warriors and nobles incorporated Cipactli imagery into their regalia, associating themselves with the primal power of creation and the transformative violence that brought the world into being. Temples were sometimes conceptualized as the body of Cipactli or Tlaltecutli, with entrances representing the monster's mouth, so that entering sacred space meant being symbolically consumed by the earth, descending into its hungry jaws to commune with divine forces. The myth also reveals the Aztec understanding of duality and transformation, the recognition that categories are fluid and beings can occupy multiple states simultaneously. Cipactli was monster and material, enemy and foundation, chaos and order, destruction and creation. Its death was also its apotheosis, its transformation into something greater than it had been. The earth was simultaneously the corpse of a defeated beast and a living goddess, both dead and alive, both victim and power. This comfort with paradox, this acceptance that truth contains contradictions, permeated Aztec thought and distinguished it from more binary cosmological systems. Nothing was ever entirely one thing or another. Everything contained its opposite within itself. Modern scholars debate the symbolic meanings embedded in the Cipactli myth, seeing in it possible reflections of Aztec observations about geology, ecology, or even political philosophy. The tearing apart of a single entity to create a diverse landscape might represent the fragmentation of unified tribes into separate city-states, or the transformation of natural resources into cultural artifacts through human labor. The perpetual hunger of the earth might reflect agricultural realities in the Valley of Mexico, where maintaining soil fertility required constant attention and the incorporation of organic matter. These interpretations add layers of meaning without diminishing the myth's primary function as a cosmological explanation, demonstrating how ancient peoples embedded practical knowledge within sacred narratives. What cannot be debated is the myth's centrality to Aztec identity and worldview. The story of Cipactli taught that violence and creation were inseparable, that beauty emerged from brutality, that the ground beneath human feet was sacred not despite, but because of its monstrous origins. It established that hunger was a cosmic principle operating at all levels of existence, from the smallest creature to the earth itself to the gods in their celestial realm. It revealed that transformation required destruction, that nothing new could emerge unless something old was torn apart and reconstituted. Every sacrifice performed on Aztec altars echoed this primordial act. Every heart offered to the gods replicated in miniature the cosmic drama when Cipactli was torn asunder to birth the world. The beast that became the earth remained forever hungry, and the Mexica considered it their sacred duty to feed it, maintaining through blood and ritual the balance established at the moment of creation, honoring the monster whose death made all life possible, and acknowledging that existence itself rests upon foundations of violence transformed into beauty through divine intention and cosmic necessity. Listen carefully to the sounds near water, especially at twilight, when shadows grow long and the boundary between day and night dissolves into uncertainty. If you hear what sounds like a child crying near a lake or river, if you hear desperate wails that tug at your heart and compel you to investigate, if every instinct tells you to rush toward the water to help, then you must do the opposite. You must turn and run, because what waits in those depths is not a child, but something far older and infinitely more dangerous. The Mexica knew this creature well, feared it deeply, and understood that it served purposes beyond human comprehension. They called it the Ahuizotl, and to be chosen by it was simultaneously a curse and a blessing, a death that granted honor even as it brought terror to those who witnessed the dragging of bodies beneath the surface. The name Ahuizotl translates roughly as thorny one of the water or water opossum, though these translations fail to capture the full horror of what the creature represented. Physical descriptions varied slightly across different accounts, but certain features remained consistent and deeply disturbing. The Ahuizotl was said to be roughly the size of a medium dog, with sleek fur that shed water perfectly, allowing it to move through rivers and lakes with supernatural speed and silence. Its body resembled that of an otter or dog, streamlined for aquatic hunting, with powerful legs that propelled it through water faster than any human could swim. But the truly nightmarish feature, the detail that distinguished it from any natural animal, was the hand at the end of its tail, a fully formed human hand with fingers and opposable thumb, capable of grasping with strength that belied its appendage. This hand was the Ahuizotl's primary weapon and tool, the instrument through which it fulfilled its sacred duty. The creature would lurk beneath the surface of water, invisible to those who walked along shores or waded in shallows, waiting with infinite patience for the right victim to approach. When someone came within range, the Ahuizotl would extend its tail, the hand breaking the surface to grab an ankle or wrist with crushing force. The victim would be pulled under before they could scream, dragged to the bottom with supernatural strength, held down until their lungs filled with water and consciousness fled. But this was not random predation, not simple hunting for sustenance. The Ahuizotl served Tlaloc, the rain god, and those it drowned were being selected for a specific divine purpose, chosen to join the paradise of Tlalocan rather than face the trials of Mictlan. Tlaloc was one of the most important deities in the Aztec pantheon, controller of rain and lightning, provider of the water that made agriculture possible in the Valley of Mexico. His realm, Tlalocan, was described as a paradise of eternal spring, where trees bore fruit perpetually, where flowers bloomed in endless profusion, where those who dwelt there knew neither hunger nor pain. But entry to this paradise was not achieved through virtuous living or proper ritual observance. Instead, Tlalocan was reserved for those who died through water or lightning, those claimed by Tlaloc's element or struck down by his celestial weapons. Drowning victims, those killed by lightning strikes, people who died from diseases associated with water such as dropsy or edema, All these souls bypassed Mictlan entirely and went directly to the rain god's paradise. The Ahuizotl functioned as Tlaloc's agent in this selection process, actively choosing individuals to receive this blessed fate. The crying sounds the creature made were not random animal noises, but deliberate lures, calculated to exploit human compassion and draw victims close to water's edge. Parents would hear what sounded exactly like their child's voice calling for help. Fishermen would hear companions supposedly fallen overboard. Women washing clothes by riverside would hear infants wailing in distress. The Ahuizotl was a master mimic, a trickster whose deception served divine will. Those who fell for the ruse and approached the water would find themselves grabbed by that impossible hand, pulled under before they could realize their mistake. The Mexica taught their children from earliest age to be suspicious of crying near water, to investigate such sounds cautiously, if at all, to understand that not every plea for help was genuine and that some traps wore the face of vulnerability. But here is where Aztec cosmology reveals its profound difference from moral frameworks more familiar to Western thinking. Being killed by the Ahuizotl was not considered a tragedy or injustice, but an honor, a mark of divine favor that granted the victim immediate entry to paradise. When a body was found bearing the marks of a Ahuizotl attack, when someone disappeared near water and was later recovered with characteristic wounds, their family did not grieve in the same way they would for other deaths. Instead, they recognized that Tlaloc had chosen their loved one, that the Ahuizotl had served as divine selector, and that the deceased now dwelt in eternal springtime, rather than facing the 4-year ordeal through Mictlan's 9 levels. There was still grief, still loss, but tempered by the knowledge that this death had meaning and destination. The bodies of those taken by Ahuizotl bore specific marks that priests could identify. The creature's hand would leave bruises or lacerations on ankles, wrists, or necks, distinctive patterns that revealed how the victim had been grabbed and dragged under. Additionally, those drowned by Ahuizotl were said to have their eyes, teeth, and nails removed before the body was released back to the surface. This detail reveals the ritualistic of the drowning, suggesting that the Ahuizotl did more than simply kill, but prepared the body for its journey to Tlalocan through specific post-mortem procedures. These missing features were not random violence, but sacred transformation, the removal of certain physical elements as part of the transition from mortal to blessed dead. When a body marked by Ahuizotl was discovered, strict protocols governed how it should be handled. Only priests specially trained in the rituals of Tlaloc could touch the corpse. Common people, even family members, were forbidden from direct contact. The priests would collect the body and conduct ceremonies that honored both the deceased and the deity who had claimed them. The funeral rites differed significantly from those performed for ordinary deaths, emphasizing water symbolism and rain imagery, celebrating the victim's new residence in paradise rather than mourning their loss to the underworld. Offerings would be made to Tlaloc in gratitude for his selection of the deceased, and the family might gain social status from having a member chosen for Tlalocan, their grief transformed into a form of pride. The Ahuizotl was not unique, but rather one of several creatures that served Tlaloc in various capacities. The Tlaloco were smaller versions of the rain god himself, assistants who lived in the 4 corners of Tlalocan and helped pour rain onto the earth from giant clay jars. The Ehecatontin were wind spirits that preceded rainstorms, clearing the air and announcing Tlaloc's approach. But the Ahuizotl occupied a special role as active hunter and selector, the only one of Tlaloc's servants that directly killed humans and claimed them for paradise. This made it both more feared and more respected than the others, a creature whose appearance meant certain death, but also certain salvation, whose attack was simultaneously the worst and best fate that could befall someone. Historical records suggest that the Ahuizotl legend may have been based on observations of actual animals, perhaps river otters or similar aquatic mammals whose behaviors were interpreted through the lens of religious belief. The Mexica were keen observers of eye, and many of their mythological creatures bore some relationship to real animals, elaborated and transformed through cultural storytelling and theological necessity. But whether the Ahuizotl existed as a physical creature or purely as a mythological explanation for drowning deaths, matters less than understanding what the legend reveals about Aztec worldview. It shows a cosmology where death was not uniformly negative, where certain ways of dying were preferable to others, where divine intervention could take forms that appeared monstrous but served benevolent purposes. The paradox of the Ahuizotl, this creature that killed people as an act of divine favor, encapsulates the complexity of Aztec religious thought. Modern sensibilities struggle with the concept of death as blessing, of being hunted and drowned as receiving honor, but the Mexica had no such difficulty. They understood that existence operated according to rules that transcended human comfort, that the gods had their own logic and purposes, and that human life was simultaneously precious and expendable depending on cosmic necessity. The Ahuizotl was not evil, but functional, not a monster, but a servant, not an enemy, but an agent of transformation who changed the fate of those it touched from ordinary to blessed. The legend persists in Mexican folklore even today, though often merged with other water spirit stories and sometimes confused with the more famous La Llorona. Some regions still tell of strange creatures in lakes and rivers, of crying sounds that lure the unwary to their doom, of unexplained drownings where bodies are found with mysterious marks. The Ahuizotl has become generalized into a broader warning about water's dangers, but echoes of its original theological significance remain in the respect shown to drowning victims and the special rituals still performed in some communities when someone dies by water. The creature reminds us that the Aztec cosmos was never simple, never divided cleanly into good and evil, but operated according to complex principles where death could be gift, monsters could be holy, and a hand reaching from the depths might be extending not threat, but invitation to paradise eternal. Long before Spanish colonizers brought their own legends to Mexico, long before the story of La Llorona became the most famous ghost tale in Latin America, the Mexica knew a woman who wandered through darkness weeping. Her cries echoed through the streets of Tenochtitlan in the hours before dawn, a sound so mournful and terrible that those who heard it would cover their ears and pray for sunrise. She appeared at crossroads dressed entirely in white, her face hidden beneath veils or sometimes revealed as a skull, her voice carrying prophecies of doom and disaster that proved terrifyingly accurate. Her name was Cihuacoatl, Serpent Woman, and she was not a ghost of someone who had died, but a goddess who had existed since the beginning of time, walking between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, announcing transformations both personal and cosmic that would tear apart everything people thought they knew. Cihuacoatl was one of the most complex and multifaceted deities in the Aztec pantheon, a goddess whose roles and associations spread across numerous domains of existence. She was known by many names, each revealing a different aspect of her and power. They called her Tonantzin, our revered mother, acknowledging her ancient maternal authority. She was Quilastli, who created the first humans alongside Quetzalcoatl. She was Yaochihuatl, warrior woman, patron of female warriors and midwives who understood that bringing life into the world was a form of combat as dangerous as any battlefield. She presided over childbirth, over women who died in labor, over the transformation of girls into women and women into mothers. But she was also the prophet of disaster, the herald of change, the voice that announced when the old order was ending and something new and terrible was about to begin. Physically, Cihuacoatl appeared as a woman of striking and unsettling beauty, though her form could shift depending on the context and the observer. In some representations, she wore white robes that covered her from neck to feet, the color of death and mourning in Aztec culture, rather than the purity it signified in European traditions. Her face might appear young and beautiful, or ancient and withered, sometimes human and sometimes partly serpentine, reflecting her name and her connection to the transformative power of snakes who shed their skins and are reborn. She carried a child in her arms or on her back, a cradle board that held either an infant or obsidian knives, that dual symbol of creation and destruction, nurturing and violence. When she walked, the sound of her footsteps echoed strangely, as if she existed partially in another dimension, her presence warping the normal sounds of night. The crying that defined her legend was not random sorrow, but specific lamentation, words that those who heard them could distinguish even through their terror. She would wail variations of a particular phrase, "Oh, my children, we are about to go forever," or "Oh, my children, where shall I take you?" These cries were not merely emotional expressions, but prophecies, warnings that disaster approached, that the cosmic order was about to shift in ways that would destroy what currently existed. Aztec mothers told their children that when Cihuacoatl wept in the night, it meant someone in the community would die soon, that war was approaching, that famine or plague would arrive, that the gods were displeased, and punishment was imminent. To hear her voice was to know with certainty that suffering was coming, even if the exact of that suffering remained mysterious until it manifested. But Cihuacoatl's most famous prophecies concerned the fall of the Aztec Empire itself, predictions that became intertwined with the historical accounts of the Spanish conquest in ways that blur the line between mythology and documented history. According to multiple chronicles recorded shortly after the conquest, Cihuacoatl began appearing with increasing frequency in the years before Cortés arrived, her wailing heard throughout Tenochtitlan, night after night. The people grew terrified, understanding that her persistent presence meant something catastrophic was approaching, though they could not imagine what form that catastrophe would take. Some accounts claim that she appeared to Moctezuma himself, delivering prophecies directly to the emperor about strangers from across the water who would bring the end of everything the Mexica had built. Whether these prophecies were genuine predictions or later insertions that shaped historical narratives to include mythological foreshadowing, they reveal how deeply Cihuacoatl was associated with transformation, endings, and the collapse of established order. Her connection to crossroads was particularly significant in Aztec cosmology and magical practice. Crossroads represented liminal spaces where multiple paths met, where choices had to be made, where the normal rules of reality grew thin and supernatural forces could more easily manifest. Cihuacoatl appeared at these intersections because she herself existed at intersections, at the meeting point of life and death, creation and destruction, human and divine. Travelers who encountered her at crossroads would be paralyzed with terror, unable to move as she passed, her white robes flowing around her, her voice filling the air with sorrowful prophecy. Some said that looking directly at her face would cause madness or death, that only those who kept their eyes lowered and their prayers constant could survive the encounter intact. Offerings were left at crossroads to appease her, to acknowledge her power, to request that she move on without causing harm to those who lived nearby. The role of Cihuacoatl as patron of midwives and protector of women in childbirth reveals another crucial aspect of her mythology. Childbirth in Aztec society was understood as warfare, a literal battle where women risked their lives to bring new souls into the world. Women who died in labor were honored as warriors, their deaths considered equivalent to dying in combat, their souls granted the same paradise as fallen soldiers. Cihuacoatl presided over this dangerous transition, present at every birth, determining whether mother and child would survive or whether one or both would cross into death. Midwives invoked her name during difficult deliveries, called upon her power to ease suffering and guide souls safely through the passage. But she was an unpredictable patron, as likely to claim a life as to preserve it, her decisions following cosmic logic that mortals could not fully comprehend. This connection to childbirth and maternal death links Cihuacoatl to the Cihuateteo, those women who died in labor and became powerful supernatural beings who haunted the night. Some sources suggest that Cihuacoatl was the leader or patron of these spirits, that they followed her through darkness, that her wailing was joined by their cries. The Cihuateteo would appear on specific calendar days at crossroads, just as their patron goddess did, stealing children or causing illness, embodying the dangerous liminality of women who existed between life and death, between human and divine. The association between Cihuacoatl and these spirits emphasized that maternal death was not simply tragedy, but transformation, that women who perished bringing forth life gained supernatural power and continued to affect the mortal realm long after their bodies had been laid to rest. When we examine the legend of La Llorona, the weeping woman who haunts rivers and waterways, crying for her lost children, the influence of Cihuacuatl becomes undeniable. The Spanish colonial version claims that La Llorona was a woman who drowned her children in a fit of madness or revenge and now wanders eternally searching for them, her ghostly wails heard near water throughout Mexico and Latin America. But this story is clearly a Christianized adaptation of the much older Cihuacuatl legend, transformed to fit European narrative patterns about sin, punishment, and redemption. The white dress, the crying at night, the prophecy of doom for those who hear her, the association with crossroads and liminal spaces, all these elements existed in the pre-Columbian mythology of Cihuacuatl, long before Spanish priests tried to explain indigenous supernatural beliefs through the lens of Christian morality. La Llorona is not a separate entity, but Cihuacuatl wearing a new name, surviving centuries of cultural suppression by adapting to new theological frameworks while maintaining her essential. The Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan featured a shrine dedicated to Cihuacuatl, where priests performed rituals in her honor and women came to pray for safe childbirth or to honor those who had died in labor. The ceremonies involved offerings of flowers, incense, and sacrificial victims who were understood to be transforming into divine messengers, carrying prayers and petitions directly to the goddess. During certain festivals, a woman would be chosen to impersonate Cihuacuatl, dressing in white robes, carrying the cradle with obsidian blades, walking through the streets while crying out warnings and prophecies. This ritual performance allowed the community to interact with the goddess's energy in a controlled context, to honor her power while channeling it through sanctioned religious activity. The chosen woman would eventually be sacrificed, her death transforming her into a direct connection to Cihuacuatl, her blood feeding the cosmic forces that the goddess represented. What makes Cihuacuatl particularly fascinating is how she embodies the Aztec understanding that prophecy and transformation are inseparable, that knowing disaster is coming does not mean it can be prevented. Her warnings were not given to allow people to change their fate, but to prepare them psychologically and spiritually for inevitable change. When she wept in the night announcing doom, she was not offering a chance at salvation, but providing knowledge that allowed people to face what was coming with understanding rather than complete surprise. This fatalistic approach to prophecy reflects the broader Aztec worldview that accepted the cyclical of destruction and renewal, that understood the fifth sun would eventually end, just as the previous four had ended, and that human agency could delay, but never ultimately prevent the transformations built into the structure of reality itself. Cihuacuatl's cries were not pleas for help, but announcements of cosmic inevitability. Her sorrow genuine, but her message unchangeable. Her maternal concern for humanity, mixed with her divine knowledge that all created things must eventually be destroyed so that new creation can occur. Death in childbirth was not mourning, but transformation. Not tragedy, but apotheosis. Not an ending, but a violent rebirth into supernatural power. When a woman died, bringing life into the world, when her body gave out under the strain of labor, when her blood soaked the birthing mat and her final breath carried both agony and determination, she did not descend to Mictlan like ordinary mortals. Instead, she rose. She became one of the Cihuateteo, the divine women, warrior spirits who had proven their courage in the most dangerous battle of all, the struggle to push a new soul from the realm of potential into the realm of the living. The Mexica understood what many cultures refuse to acknowledge, that creating life is as perilous as taking it, that the battlefield and the birthing room both run red with the blood of heroes, and that women who die in labor earn the same honors as men who die with obsidian blades in their hands. The word Cihuateteo means divine women or deified women, a title that reveals the Aztec understanding that certain deaths conferred godhood upon those who experienced them. These were not ghosts in the sense of lingering spirits who could not move on, not trapped souls seeking resolution or peace. They were transformed beings, elevated to a status between mortal and fully divine, granted powers and purposes that transcended their earthly existence. They dwelt in the western sky, in the house of the sun, and each evening they accompanied Tonatiuh from noon to sunset, bearing the solar disk on their shoulders, just as male warriors bore it from dawn to noon. This cosmic duty revealed the Mexica belief in gender symmetry within the structure of the universe, the recognition that masculine and feminine forces were equally necessary to maintain celestial order and prevent the sun from falling from the sky. Physically, the Cihuateteo were depicted as skeletal or partially decomposed women, their faces bearing the marks of death, their bodies showing the signs of the ordeal that had killed them. Some representations showed them with clawed hands and feet, predatory features that marked them as dangerous despite their maternal origins. Their faces might be painted white or show skull-like characteristics, and they wore the clothing of noble women, elaborate huipils, and skirts that signified their elevated status. Their hair was often shown loose and wild, no longer bound in the neat arrangements of living women, but flowing free in supernatural disarray. They carried weapons sometimes, staffs or weaving batons transformed into instruments of power. Domestic tools become divine armaments. Their appearance was meant to inspire both reverence and terror, to acknowledge their sacrifice while warning of their dangerous. The Cihuateteo descended to Earth on specific calendar days, dates determined by the sacred 260-day ritual calendar that governed Aztec religious life. These descent days occurred at regular intervals, and on these nights the divine women would appear at crossroads, those liminal spaces where paths intersected and the boundaries between worlds grew thin. They were particularly associated with the western crossroads, reflecting their dwelling place in the western sky, but could appear wherever roads met and choices had to be made. The Mexica marked these dates carefully, warning children to stay indoors after dark, instructing parents to keep infants close and protected. Crossroads would be swept clean and offerings left, small gifts of food or flowers or incense meant to appease the divine women and encourage them to pass by without causing harm. But harm was what the Cihuateteo brought when they walked among the living. They would steal children if they found them unattended, claiming young souls for reasons mortals could not comprehend. Some said they sought to replace the children they had died before properly birthing, that their maternal instincts remained but became twisted by death into dangerous obsession. Others claimed they served cosmic functions, selecting specific children whose fates required early death or transformation. The children who disappeared or fell ill after encounters with Cihuateteo were marked by the divine, chosen for purposes that transcended normal human lifespans. The spirits could also cause madness, afflicting adults with seizures or mental disturbances, paralysis, or wasting diseases. These illnesses were understood as divine intervention, the touch of supernatural power overwhelming mortal flesh and mind. Yet despite their dangerous, the Cihuateteo were honored, not feared in the sense of being evil entities to be destroyed or avoided at all costs. Temples were dedicated to them, ceremonies performed in their honor, offerings made to acknowledge their sacrifice and appease their power. Women about to give birth would pray to the Cihuateteo, asking for their protection and guidance, seeking to survive what these spirits had not survived. Midwives invoked them during difficult deliveries, called upon their understanding of the birthing process and their power over life and death. Warriors about to enter battle would also offer prayers to the Cihuateteo, recognizing them as fellow combatants who understood courage and sacrifice, whose deaths in the birthing room mirrored deaths on the battlefield in everything except the weapon that had taken their lives. The treatment of women's bodies after death in childbirth reveals just how seriously the Mexica took the transformation into Cihuateteo. Warriors would sometimes try to steal parts of these bodies, particularly fingers and hair, believing that these relics from divine women would grant them courage and protection in combat. The bodies had to be guarded carefully during funeral preparations, watched constantly to prevent theft. This practice demonstrated the belief that the Cihuateteo possessed tangible power even in their physical remains, that the transformation from mortal to divine left traces in flesh and bone that could be accessed by those brave or foolish enough to steal them. Women who had died in childbirth were buried with ceremony and honor equal to that given to fallen warriors, their funerals attended by community leaders, their names remembered and spoken with respect. The association between the Cihuateteo and the western sky connects to broader Aztec cosmology about direction and symbolism. The west was the direction of descent, of the sun falling toward the underworld, of transition from light to darkness. It was a feminine direction, associated with water and fertility and transformation. The east, by contrast, was masculine, the place where the sun rose, where male warriors took up their duty to carry the solar disk. This directional gender symbolism pervaded Aztec thought, appearing in architecture, in ritual practices, in the organization of space both sacred and mundane. The Cihuateteo dwelling in the west and accompanying the sun through afternoon and sunset reflected this cosmological pattern, placing divine mothers at the transitional edge between day and night, life and death, the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Certain deities had special relationships with the Cihuateteo. Cihuacuatl, the serpent woman we encountered in the previous chapter, was sometimes described as their leader or patron, the goddess who commanded these spirits and directed their activities. Tlazolteotl, goddess of filth and purification, sexual desire and childbirth, also had connections to the Cihuateteo through her associations with the birthing process. Xochiquetzal, goddess of beauty and fertility, represented what these women had been in life, while the Cihuateteo embodied what death in service of creation had transformed them into. These divine relationships created a network of feminine power that complemented and balanced the masculine warrior deities, demonstrating that Aztec cosmology recognized multiple forms of courage and sacrifice, multiple paths to divine status and supernatural power. The parallel between warriors who died in battle and women who died in childbirth reveals profound aspects of Aztec gender concepts. Both were understood as dying in service to the community and the cosmic order. Both earned the right to bypass Mictlan and dwell in the House of the Sun. Both were honored with elaborate ceremonies and remembered with reverence. This equation of warfare and childbirth, of the battlefield and the birthing room, granted women who died in labor a status that many ancient cultures denied them. They were not victims or casualties, but heroes, not tragic figures, but triumphant ones, who had given everything in the ultimate act of creation. The Cihuateteo represented the apotheosis of maternal sacrifice, the transformation of female suffering into divine power, the recognition that bringing life into the world requires courage equal to any warrior's bravery. Modern Day of the Dead celebrations preserve echoes of the Cihuateteo, though the explicit connection is often obscured or forgotten. The honored dead who return on specific calendar days, the offerings left at crossroads, the understanding that death transforms rather than simply ending existence, these concepts all trace back to beliefs about the Cihuateteo and other divine dead. The calavera images of skeletal women dressed in elaborate clothing directly recall the appearance of these divine mothers, death and femininity and beauty, intertwined in ways that acknowledge rather than deny mortality's reality. Contemporary Mexican culture continues to honor women who die in childbirth with special recognition, understanding at some deep cultural level that maternal death represents sacrifice rather than simple tragedy, transformation rather than mere ending. The Cihuateteo walk still through Mexican nights, their names changed or forgotten, but their essence preserved. Those divine mothers who prove that creation requires destruction, that bringing life into the world sometimes demands the ultimate price, and that women who pay that price do not simply disappear, but transform into powers that shape reality itself from the western sky, where they dwell in eternal sunset. The sun that rises each morning, the golden disk that traverses the sky and makes life possible on Earth, is not the first sun that has illuminated this world. It is not even the second or third. The Mexica knew with absolute certainty that humanity lived under the fifth sun, that 4 previous ages of creation had already risen and fallen, each destroyed by a different catastrophe, each ending in the annihilation of the human race that inhabited it. This was not ancient history to them, but urgent present reality, a cosmological truth that shaped every aspect of their civilization and justified their most controversial religious practices. The fifth sun under which they lived was called Nahueolin, four movement, and it was destined to end in catastrophic earthquakes that would tear the world apart unless the gods received constant nourishment through human sacrifice. This was the cosmic bargain that defined Aztec existence, the terrible knowledge that shaped their worldview and made them willing to offer thousands of hearts on temple altars. The story of how the fifth sun came to be reveals the Aztec understanding that greatness emerges not from privilege or beauty, but from humility and willingness to sacrifice. After the fourth sun had been destroyed in a devastating flood, the gods gathered in darkness at Teotihuacan, the ancient city whose ruins the Aztecs revered as the birthplace of the gods themselves. They assembled to decide who among them would sacrifice themselves to become the new sun, who would throw themselves into the cosmic fire and emerge transformed into the celestial body that would illuminate the fifth age of creation. The task required complete self-immolation, the willingness to be consumed entirely by flames with no guarantee of resurrection or transformation. It was, in essence, a death without certainty of rebirth, an act of faith that transcended calculation or self-interest. Two gods volunteered for this ultimate sacrifice, but they could not have been more different in status and appearance. The first was Tecuchistecatl, a wealthy and proud deity who dressed in elaborate finery, whose clothing was adorned with precious stones and feathers, whose very presence announced his importance and nobility. He prepared for his sacrifice with expensive offerings, bringing quetzal feathers and balls of gold, jade spines for bloodletting and coral incense, everything of the finest quality that wealth could provide. The second volunteer was Nanahuatzin, a humble god whose name meant pimply one or covered with sores, a deity of low status whose body was covered with boils and ulcers, whose poverty was as evident as Tecuchistecatl's wealth. Where the proud god brought gold and jade, Nanahuatzin could only offer bundles of reeds and maguey thorns still stained with his own blood, and incense made from his scabs rather than precious copal. The contrast between them was absolute, and all the assembled gods assumed that Tecuchistecatl would become the sun, while Nanahuatzin would achieve the lesser honor of becoming the moon. The gods built a massive bonfire, flames reaching high into the darkness, heat so intense that it pushed back the assembled deities who had gathered to witness the sacrifice. For 4 days the fire burned, fed continuously until it blazed with supernatural intensity, until the air itself seemed to shimmer and warp around it. Finally, the moment arrived when the volunteers must fulfill their commitment and throw themselves into the flames. Tecuchistecatl, the proud god, stepped forward first, his fine clothes gleaming in the firelight, his confident stride faltering as he approached the edge of the pyre. The heat was overwhelming, the flames so fierce that he could not force himself to take the final step. 3 times he approached, and 3 times his courage failed him, his body refusing to move forward despite his will. Fear held him paralyzed at the edge of transformation, his pride insufficient to overcome his instinct for self-preservation. Then Nanahuatzin, the diseased god, the humble one whom no one expected to show courage, closed his eyes and ran forward without hesitation. He threw himself into the heart of the flames with absolute commitment, his body consumed instantly by the cosmic fire, his sacrifice complete before doubt could poison determination. The assembled gods watched in awe as flames engulfed him, as his form dissolved into pure energy, as his willingness to die transformed him into something far greater than he had been. Shamed by this display of courage from one so lowly, Tecuchistecatl finally gathered his will and followed, leaping into the flames moments after Nanahuatzin had disappeared into their heart. The fire consumed him as well, accepting his delayed sacrifice, transforming his proud flesh into divine light. From the cosmic pyre, 2 celestial bodies emerged and rose into the sky. Nanahuatzin, who had sacrificed himself first and without hesitation, became the sun, the blazing disk whose light illuminated the world and made life possible. Tecuchistecatl, who had hesitated and only sacrificed himself after being shamed into action, became the moon, a lesser light that could only shine by reflecting the sun's glory. This myth taught a profound lesson that pervaded Aztec society. That true nobility came from action rather than appearance, from sacrifice rather than pride, from humble courage rather than ostentatious display. The sun god they worshipped daily had once been covered in sores, had been poor and ugly, had been dismissed by those who valued surface over substance. His transformation validated the worth of those whom society overlooked and established the principle that greatness could emerge from anywhere if courage and commitment were present. But the story did not end with the creation of the sun and moon. When Nanahuatzin emerged from the flames transformed into Tonatiuh, the sun god, he rose into the sky and then stopped moving. He hung at the horizon, refusing to begin his journey across the heavens, his light illuminating only a portion of the world while the rest remained in darkness. The gods called out to him, demanding to know why he remained stationary, and his response sent shockwaves through the assembly. He would not move unless all the other gods sacrificed themselves and gave him their blood, unless they offered him the precious liquid of life that would provide the energy he needed to make his daily journey across the sky. The price of the sun's movement, the cost of maintaining the cosmic order, was the death of the divine. The assembled gods were horrified and outraged by this demand. Some refused outright, declaring that they would not submit to death even to make the sun move. But Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, understood the necessity and took up an obsidian blade. One by one, he killed the other gods, opening their chests and offering their hearts to Tonatiuh, spilling their divine blood so that the sun would have the strength to move. The gods sacrificed themselves not willingly, but out of necessity, recognizing that without their deaths, the fifth sun would fail before it had properly begun, that all creation would remain frozen in permanent twilight. Their blood and hearts fed the sun, and finally, satisfied with this offering, Tonatiuh began his journey across the sky, establishing the daily cycle that would govern all existence in the fifth age. This myth established the theological foundation for human sacrifice in Aztec culture, the understanding that the sun required constant nourishment to continue his daily journey. If the gods themselves had to die to make the sun move initially, then humans must continue providing sustenance to prevent him from stopping again. Every heart offered on temple altars was feeding Tonatiuh, giving him strength to rise each morning and cross the sky each day, preventing the cosmic collapse that would result if he faltered. The Mexica did not perform human sacrifice out of cruelty or bloodlust, but out of genuine belief that they were fulfilling a cosmic obligation, that their rituals were literally maintaining the universe, that without their participation in this cycle of sacrifice, the sun would fail and all creation would end. This was their burden and their honor, their responsibility as the people chosen to feed the gods and preserve existence itself. The fifth sun was called Nahue Olin, for movement, because it was destined to end through earthquakes, through the violent shaking and tearing apart of the earth itself. The symbol for this age showed the sun god with his tongue extended in the shape of an obsidian blade, demanding blood and hearts, his face expressing both hunger and determination. The four previous suns surrounded him in the calendar stone, each showing how it had ended. The first sun destroyed by jaguars that devoured humanity, the second by hurricane winds that swept everything away, the third by rain of fire that burned the world, the fourth by flood that drowned all existence. The fifth sun bore within it the seeds of its own destruction, earthquakes that would intensify until finally the earth tore apart completely, and the age ended just as all ages must end. The only question was when this apocalypse would arrive, and whether human sacrifice could delay it long enough for the Aztec civilization to fulfill its cosmic purpose. This eschatological awareness shaped every aspect of Mexica life and thought. They lived with the knowledge that their world was temporary, that destruction was inevitable, that all they built would eventually crumble in the earthquakes that would end the fifth sun. Yet rather than producing despair, this knowledge seemed to generate intense vitality, a determination to live fully and honor the gods completely while existence continued. The myth of the fifth sun taught that life emerges from sacrifice, that order requires constant maintenance, that nothing valuable comes without cost. Nana Watson's transformation from diseased outcast to cosmic lord demonstrated that destiny could be chosen through courage rather than granted through privilege, that those willing to sacrifice everything could become greater than those who risked nothing. The fifth sun rises each morning because a god covered in sores threw himself into flames without hesitation, and it continues moving across the sky because blood flows on temple altars, because the Mexica understood that existence itself requires constant feeding, and because they accepted the terrible responsibility of keeping the universe alive through sacrifice that horrified their enemies, but that they considered the highest form of devotion and the ultimate expression of cosmic partnership with the divine. Among the most chilling and enigmatic deities of the Aztec pantheon walked the figure of Zipatotec, Lord of the Flayed and bringer of renewal. His presence was both a promise and a threat, life emerging from agony, beauty rising out of horror, a reminder that all cycles of birth and harvest were fundamentally tied to the shedding of old skin. Zipatotec's mythology, tangled in blood and sanctified suffering, encapsulates the paradox the Mexica understood better than their Spanish conquerors: that creation without destruction is inconceivable, that new forms require the sacrifice of what once was, and that true flowering demands not only death, but the visible transformation of flesh. The name Zipatotec means Our Lord, the Flayed One. He was depicted as a man wearing the skin of a sacrificial victim over his own body, the old surface stretched crudely over a living figure, hands dangling from his wrists and face peeking out beneath the lifeless mask. This visceral imagery shocks modern eyes, yet to the Aztecs it carried layered meanings. Zipatotec represented the cycle of life and vegetation. Just as the earth is flayed by farmers at planting, just as seeds must shed their husks to sprout, so must the gods themselves be stripped for the world to renew. He was the deity of agriculture, of spring, of goldsmiths and artists, and also, paradoxically, of disease, war, and suffering. Where his presence lingered, fields ripened after famine, epidemics were followed by recovery, and the suffering of one became the salvation of many. The annual festival of Tlacaxipehualistli, or Flaying of Men, was dedicated to Zipatotec and occurred each spring, marking the rebirth of and the cosmic obligation to feed the gods. Warriors captured in ritual battle were sacrificed, their hearts offered atop the Great Pyramid, before their bodies were ritually flayed and the skins removed whole and unbroken. These skins, now sacred, were donned by priests who wore them for 20 days, transforming themselves into living embodiments of the god. They walked through markets and temples, receiving gifts from supplicants whose offerings sought both to appease Zipatotec and share in his creative energy. The bloody skins came to symbolize the old season, cast off to allow for fertility and rain. They also expressed the price that must be paid for any harvest or artistic process, a visible reminder of transmutation through ordeal. In ancient iconography, Zipatotec is shown painted in red and yellow, the colors of sunrise and ripening maize, his flesh covered in punctures to signify the wounds of transformation. In his hands, he sometimes carries stalks of new maize, or the rattlestaff of priests who imitate the shaking seed pod. Copper ornaments and gold necklaces adorn his icon, linking him to both wealth and the forge, to material splendor and its divine source. He smiles grimly from beneath the mask of human skin. The new visage is smooth, greenish-yellow with life, emerging from the decaying shell. Where he stepped, the boundary between terror and hope blurred. Prayers to him asked not for mercy, but for the strength to endure necessary pain, for the courage to let go of the old self so the new might grow. The myth of Zipatotec does not hide its violence. In one version, the god was flayed alive by his own father, or else flayed himself to provide food for humanity. The act was not punishment, but a gift, the ultimate offering, the relinquishment of perfection, so the hungry could eat and the trees could blossom. Zipatotec revealed through his own agony, the sanctity of vulnerability, the necessity of risk and loss. Contemporary harvest rituals echoed this myth. Seeds planted beneath the ground, their husks rotting away, so the sprout could break through and become grain. Young men and women enduring rites of passage, shedding their childhood to assume new responsibilities. The world renews itself by stripping away the surface, by revealing the living heart underneath decay and death. Yet, unlike some deities, Xipe was not only a god of pain and ordeal. He was also healer and protector, patron of craftspeople, musicians and dancers, bringing inspiration as well as transformation. During his festival, people threw stones at one another, enacting the afflictions and struggles Xipe ruled over as a way to banish them from the body. Those afflicted with disease sought his favor, praying for release from rashes and sores, for the blossoming of wellness where sickness had taken hold. Soldiers carried his image into battle, hoping he would help them pierce enemy armor as easily as the gods had pierced his skin. And in his honor, captives were dressed in gold and arrayed with flowers before being sacrificed, a moment of grace, however fleeting, before dissolution. The theological message behind the bloody rituals of Xipe often eludes modern readers, horrified by the image of priests strolling through bustling markets dressed in freshly flayed skins. For the Mexica, this sight inspired awe more than revulsion. The priests became living gateways, bridging the human world and divine renewal. Anyone encountering a priest in this state would reach out to touch the hanging hands or stroke the mask, transferring energy from suffering to hope, from death to possibility. It was thought that the suffering of the individual, willingly or unwillingly endured, brought prosperity for the entire community. Through the sight, sound, and scent of renewal, each citizen participated in the promise that next year the maize would return, fields would flourish, and life would go on. Xipe symbolism endures in the art and ritual of Mexico to this day. Though his name is rarely spoken outside history books, every spring, as the old plants wither and new ones appear, as teens emerge from rites of passage to join the world of adults, as the ill cast off illness for new strength, the legacy of the flayed god lives again. In striking a balance between the horror of loss and the joy of resurgence, between the grimace of pain and the smile of new potential, the myth invites modern eyes to see all transformation as sacred, all endings as beginnings. Xipe would remind the world that beneath even the bleakest decay, a new self waits to emerge, and that to heal, one must sometimes accept the wound, celebrating not just the beauty of the flower, but the cost that brought it forth. In the heart of Tenochtitlan, before the great Templo Mayor, where thousands of hearts were offered to feed the sun, there rested a monumental disk of stone that contained within its carved surface the entire history of creation and the inevitable future of destruction. This was not merely a calendar, though Spanish chroniclers would call it such, reducing its cosmic significance to the mundane function of tracking days and months. This was the Sunstone, a prophetic monument that weighed more than 24 tons, measured nearly 12 feet in diameter, and bore within its intricate carvings the complete cosmological understanding of the Mexica people. Every symbol, etched into its basalt surface, told a story of worlds that had risen and fallen, of gods who had sacrificed themselves to birth new ages, and of the apocalypse that would inevitably consume the fifth sun under which humanity currently existed. To stand before this stone was to confront the fragility of existence itself, to understand that the world was not permanent, but borrowed time, sustained only through constant sacrifice and destined to end in catastrophic violence. At the center of the stone glares the face of Tonatiuh, the sun god, his features rendered with terrifying intensity and unmistakable hunger. His tongue extends from his mouth in the shape of an obsidian sacrificial knife, pointing downward toward the earth, a permanent reminder that the sun demands blood and hearts to continue his daily journey across the sky. His eyes stare outward with an expression that captures both divine power and desperate need, the recognition that even gods depend on mortal sacrifice to maintain their existence. His hands grasp human hearts on either side of his face, holding them firmly as if to ensure they cannot escape, as if to emphasize that these organs are not gifts but necessities, fuel without which the cosmic engine will grind to a catastrophic halt. The four corners around Tonatio's face contain symbols representing the four previous suns, the four ages of creation that preceded the current era, each one destroyed by a different form of apocalypse that left no survivors and required the gods to begin creation anew. The first sun, called Nahue Oxalotl, or Four Jaguar, appears in the upper right position of the stone. This age was inhabited by giants who ate only acorns and possessed tremendous strength but limited intelligence. The sun that illuminated their world was smaller and weaker than the current one, providing insufficient light for advanced civilization to develop. The destruction of this first age came through jaguars, massive supernatural felines that descended upon the earth and devoured every living creature, tearing apart the giants with claws and teeth until nothing remained. The Mexica believed that earthquakes occurred when these primordial jaguars stirred in their subterranean lairs, reminders that the forces that destroyed the first world still lurked beneath the surface, waiting. The symbol on the calendar stone shows a jaguar's head in profile, mouth open in perpetual hunger, marking forever the violence that ended the first attempt at creation. The second sun, Nahue Ehecatl, or Four Wind, occupies the upper left position and represents an age when humanity had evolved beyond giants but still lived in primitive conditions. This world lasted longer than the first, allowing civilization to develop rudimentary agriculture and social structures. But the gods who governed this age grew dissatisfied with humanity's progress and decided to end the experiment through hurricanes of unprecedented power. Winds strong enough to tear mountains apart swept across the earth, and humans who tried to survive by clinging to trees were transformed into monkeys as punishment for their desperate grasping. The Mexica saw monkeys as degraded humans, creatures who retained vague memories of their former status but could never reclaim it, forever trapped in animal form as consequence of trying to escape divine judgment. The wind symbol on the stone shows swirling movement, eternal rotation, the breath of gods that can create or destroy depending on divine whim. The third sun, Nahue Quayahuitl, or Four Rain, is marked in the lower right position, though the rain that fell during this age's destruction was not water, but fire. Humanity had advanced further during this era, developing complex societies and sophisticated understanding of agriculture and astronomy. But they grew arrogant, forgot their dependence on the gods, stopped making proper sacrifices and offerings. The divine response was immediate and devastating. The sky opened and rained, burning volcanic ash and molten stone, covering the earth in layers of fire that consumed every structure, every field, every living thing. Those few humans who survived the initial onslaught were transformed into birds, given wings to escape the burning ground, but stripped of their humanity and forced to live as creatures of instinct rather than reason. The symbol shows flames or volcanic eruptions, captured in stone as permanent warning that divine wrath could manifest as elemental destruction when humanity failed in its cosmic obligations. The fourth sun, Nahue Atl, or Four Water, appears in the lower left position and represents the most recent apocalypse before the current age began. This civilization had achieved the greatest sophistication of all previous ages, building cities that rivaled anything the Mexica themselves would later construct, developing arts and sciences that approached the divine in their complexity. But prosperity bred complacency, and once again, humanity failed to maintain proper relationship with the gods through sacrifice and ritual. The punishment this time was flood, not mere rain, but the dissolution of boundaries between sea and sky, water rising until it covered the highest mountains and drowned every living creature. The few survivors were transformed into fish, given the ability to breathe water, but losing their terrestrial, condemned to swim eternally in the element that had destroyed their world. The water symbol ripples outward on the stone, suggesting endless waves, the oceanic chaos that preceded creation and threatened always to return. Surrounding these symbols of previous destructions, arranged in concentric circles, are the day signs of the sacred 260-day calendar, the Tonalpohualli that governed ritual life and determined the fate of every individual born under its influence. 20 day signs repeated 13 times created a cycle considered fundamental to understanding cosmic patterns and human destiny. Each day had its own character, its own divine patrons, its own implications for activities undertaken during its hours. Birth on certain days guaranteed warrior destiny, while other days marked future priests or merchants or craftsmen. The calendar stone contains all these signs, marking time not as linear progression, but as endless cycle, days returning again and again in patterns that could be studied and interpreted but never fundamentally changed. Time itself was circular in Aztec understanding, history repeating in ever larger spirals that eventually completed full revolutions and began again. The outer ring of the stone features two massive serpents whose bodies arc around the circumference, their heads meeting at the bottom where their mouths open to reveal the face of another deity, sometimes interpreted as Tonatiuh in night aspect, or as Xiuhtecuhtli, god of fire and time. These serpents represent the fundamental duality that pervaded all Aztec thought: light and darkness, order and chaos, creation and destruction, male and female, earth and sky. They also symbolize the flow of time itself, serpents being creatures that move constantly forward, that shed their skins and are reborn, that carry both danger and wisdom in their endless movement. Between the serpents' bodies appear symbols for turquoise and jade, precious materials associated with the heavens and with divine authority, reminding viewers that the calendar stone itself was sacred object rather than mere timekeeper. But the most chilling aspect of the calendar stone, the detail that gave sleepless nights to those who truly understood its message, was the prophecy embedded in its central symbol. The current age, the fifth sun called Nahui-Olin, or four movement, was destined to end through earthquakes. Not minor tremors, but catastrophic seismic events that would tear the earth apart, causing mountains to crumble, cities to collapse, and all human civilization to be ground to dust between shifting tectonic plates. The symbol for movement, for Olin, appears prominently, showing the earth in the process of shaking, caught in eternal vibration that would eventually intensify beyond endurance. Unlike the previous four suns, where humanity's fate had been sealed by divine decision in response to specific failures, the fifth sun's destruction was built into its very name, coded into the calendar from the moment of its creation. The earthquakes would come regardless of human behavior, regardless of how many hearts were offered or how perfectly rituals were performed. Sacrifice could delay the end, could buy time for civilization to flourish temporarily, but could not prevent the ultimate collapse. This knowledge shaped every aspect of Aztec culture and psychology. They lived knowing their world was temporary, that everything they built would eventually crumble, that the end was written in stone, literally carved into the massive monument that dominated their sacred precinct. Rather than producing despair, this awareness seemed to generate incredible vitality and creative energy. If the world was ending, then every moment became precious, every act of creation defiant, every sacrifice meaningful, precisely because it postponed the inevitable even by a single day. The calendar stone stood as constant reminder that existence required maintenance, that order was fragile, that the boundary between cosmos and chaos was thinner than humans wished to believe. In its prophecy of destruction, it also contained promise that when the fifth sun finally failed and earthquakes consumed the world, the gods would gather once more in darkness and create a sixth sun, beginning the cycle anew with whatever remnants of creation survived the apocalypse to serve as seeds for the next age. In the darkest hours of night, when shadows deepen and certainty dissolves into doubt, there walks a god who embodies the fundamental chaos that underlies all apparent order. His name is Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, and he represents everything that cannot be controlled, predicted, or negotiated with through sacrifice or prayer. Where other gods had specific domains and predictable responses to human offerings, Tezcatlipoca moved through the cosmos like smoke through fingers, appearing and vanishing according to no logic mortals could discern, granting fortune to some and destroying others without apparent reason or justice. He was the god of night and sorcery, of jaguars and obsidian, of kings and slaves, of destiny itself in all its capricious and terrifying manifestations. To worship Tezcatlipoca was to acknowledge that the universe contained forces beyond human comprehension, that fate could not be avoided through proper ritual, and that the divine played games with mortal lives according to rules that changed without warning. Tezcatlipoca's most distinctive feature was the obsidian mirror he carried, or in some representations, that replaced one of his feet. This mirror was not a simple reflective surface, but a window into hidden truths, a device that revealed what lay beneath appearances and stripped away the comfortable illusions through which humans navigated existence. When someone looked into Tezcatlipoca's mirror, they saw not their physical reflection, but their true, all their secrets and shames exposed, all their hidden desires and fears made visible. The mirror showed destiny as well, revealing futures that might come to pass, though whether these visions were prophecies to be avoided or inevitabilities to be accepted remained deliberately ambiguous. Obsidian itself, that volcanic glass the Aztecs prized for making their sharpest blades and most sacred implements, was considered Tezcatlipoca's substance, his physical manifestation in the material world. Every obsidian blade used in sacrifice carried his essence. Every mirror of polished black stone was a fragment of his power. The myth of how Tezcatlipoca lost his foot reveals both his power and the cosmic violence that characterized relationships among the gods. In one version, when he and Quetzalcoatl tore apart the earth monster Chipactli to create the world, one of the creature's many mouths clamped onto Tezcatlipoca's foot and tore it off. The god continued his work of creation despite this injury, accepting permanent mutilation as the price of bringing order out of chaos. In another telling, Tezcatlipoca sacrificed his own foot voluntarily, offering it as bait to draw Chipactli close enough to be captured and dismembered. Either way, the missing foot became one of his defining characteristics, sometimes replaced by a mirror, sometimes by smoke, sometimes simply absent, leaving him with a distinctive limping gait that identified him in iconography and myth. This wound marked him as a god who had personally paid a price for creation, who bore the scars of cosmic struggle, whose imperfection paradoxically demonstrated his immense power. Tezcatlipoca was associated with the north, the direction of darkness and death, of cold winds and desolate places where human civilization could not take root. His color was black, the absence of light, the shade of night when all forms blur into indistinction and fear. His animal was the jaguar, that supreme predator of Mesoamerica, whose spotted coat mimicked the night sky studded with stars, whose ability to see in darkness made it master of the hours when humans huddled helplessly around fires. Jaguars were believed to be Tezcatlipoca's servants, or even his transformed shape, the form he took when walking the earth to observe and intervene in mortal affairs. Kings who ruled successfully were thought to have Tezcatlipoca's favor, their power granted by the god of destiny rather than earned through virtue. But this favor could be withdrawn at any moment, capriciously, without explanation or warning, reducing the mightiest emperor to dust and elevating the lowest slave to power. The relationship between Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl defined much of Aztec cosmology and represented the fundamental duality that pervaded their worldview. Quetzalcoatl was light, wisdom, order, predictability, the morning star that announced the sun's return. Tezcatlipoca was darkness, cunning, chaos, unpredictability, the night that devoured the day. They were brothers and enemies, partners and rivals, cooperating to create the world, and then immediately beginning the conflict that would define all subsequent ages. In one famous myth cycle, they took turns ruling the world as sons, each destroying the age created by the other, an eternal cycle of construction and demolition that reflected the Aztec understanding that creation and destruction were inseparable processes. Tezcatlipoca had been the sun of the First Age until Quetzalcoatl knocked him from the sky with a club, ending that era and beginning the next. This cosmic rivalry mirrored earthly conflicts between order and chaos, between those who sought to maintain stability and those who embraced change. One of the most famous stories about Tezcatlipoca involves his destruction of Quetzalcoatl's kingdom of Tolan, a legendary golden age when the feathered serpent ruled as priest king and brought unprecedented prosperity and peace to his people. Tezcatlipoca, jealous or perhaps simply following his chaotic eye, descended to Tolan in disguise and worked subtle corruption. He gave Quetzalcoatl a mirror and persuaded him to drink pulque, the sacred fermented drink that was normally forbidden to priests. Drunk and seeing his own ugliness reflected in the obsidian glass, Quetzalcoatl committed acts that violated his priestly vows, sleeping with his sister in a moment of weakness. When sobriety and awareness returned, the feathered serpent was so consumed with shame that he abandoned his kingdom and fled, eventually throwing himself into a funeral pyre, from which he emerged as the morning star. Tezcatlipoca's victory was complete not through force, but through manipulation, through showing Quetzalcoatl his own flawed and letting that knowledge destroy what armies could never conquer. In Aztec society, Tezcatlipoca was particularly associated with rulership and the burden of leadership. New kings underwent ceremonies where they acknowledged Tezcatlipoca's ultimate authority, accepting that their power came from him and could be revoked without cause. They prayed for wisdom to rule justly, while simultaneously recognizing that justice was not guaranteed, that the god might decide to destroy them and their kingdoms on a whim. This theology created rulers who understood the precariousness of power, who could not rely on divine right or hereditary authority alone, but had to constantly prove their worth, knowing that proof might not be enough. The annual ceremony called Toxcatl involved selecting a young man to impersonate Tezcatlipoca for an entire year, treating him as the god incarnate, giving him everything he desired before sacrificing him at the ceremony's climax. This ritual acknowledged that even the gods demanded sacrifice, that even divine power came with cosmic prices that must be paid. Tezcatlipoca's omnipresence in Aztec thought extended beyond religion into philosophy and psychology. He represented the concept that not everything that happened had meaning or purpose, that randomness and chaos were fundamental features of existence rather than aberrations to be explained away. When inexplicable misfortune struck, when virtuous people suffered while wicked ones prospered, when careful plans collapsed without reason, the Mexica attributed these events to Tezcatlipoca's will. This was not fatalism, but acceptance of complexity, recognition that the universe operated according to principles that transcended human notions of fairness or justice. The smoking mirror showed that beneath every surface lay hidden depths, that what appeared solid could dissolve into smoke, that seeing clearly meant confronting uncomfortable truths about oneself and the world. Modern scholars sometimes interpret Tezcatlipoca as representing the Aztec understanding of human psychology, the acknowledgement that people contain contradictions, that rational thought coexists with irrational impulses, that the self is not unified but fragmented. The mirror that showed hidden truths might be read as introspection, the difficult work of seeing oneself clearly despite the protective lies consciousness constructs. His association with jaguars and night suggests the unconscious mind, the realm of dreams and fears that emerges when daylight reason sleeps. His rivalry with Quetzalcoatl could represent the eternal human struggle between order and chaos, between the desire for structure and the impulse toward freedom, neither ever completely victorious. In this reading, Tezcatlipoca becomes not an external force, but an internal reality, the darkness that dwells within every human heart and must be acknowledged if wholeness is to be achieved. The smoking mirror continues to resonate through Mexican culture in forms both obvious and subtle. Every mirror of polished obsidian in museums carries his memory. Every acknowledgement that life contains randomness and unfairness echoes his theology. The modern fascination with fate and destiny, with fortune and misfortune as forces beyond control, reflects the ancient understanding that Tezcatlipoca embodied. His lesson was perhaps the hardest for the Aztecs to accept, and the most important, that the universe does not revolve around human needs, that the gods play games whose rules remain mysterious, that power is temporary and control illusory, and that the only appropriate response to these truths is neither despair nor denial, but acceptance, combined with fierce determination to live fully, despite knowing that the smoking mirror shows a future where all certainties dissolve and all solid things eventually fade into darkness. From the moment of birth, every person who entered the world carried with them a secret companion, an invisible double that walked beside them through every joy and suffering, every triumph and defeat. This companion was not human, but animal, not separate, but inseparably bound to the individual's fate, sharing their life force in a connection so intimate that injury to one meant injury to the other, death of one guaranteed death of both. The Mexica called this spiritual double the Nahual, and the belief in its existence revealed a cosmology where the boundaries between human and animal, between physical and spiritual, between self and other, were far more permeable than European philosophy could comprehend. To understand the Nahual was to recognize that identity was not fixed or singular, but fluid and multiple, that consciousness extended beyond the confines of human flesh, and that the natural world was not separate from humanity, but intimately interconnected with every individual soul. The word Nahual derives from the Nahuatl language and carries multiple meanings that English translation struggles to capture fully. It can mean to disguise oneself, to hide, to transform, or to assume another form. It refers both to the animal spirit companion and to the human sorcerer, capable of shape-shifting into animal form through supernatural power. This linguistic ambiguity reflects the conceptual complexity of the belief system, the recognition that transformation and concealment were fundamental aspects of reality rather than impossible fantasies. The Nahual existed simultaneously as external entity and internal aspect of self, as birthright granted to every person and as special power developed by those with magical knowledge. This duality pervaded all discussions of Nahualism, creating a belief system that operated on multiple levels simultaneously and resisted simple categorization. The assignment of a Nahual to each individual occurred at birth, determined by the day on which the child entered the world according to the sacred 260-day calendar. Each of the 20-day signs had associations with specific animals, and a skilled calendar priest could read the exact moment of birth and determine which creature would serve as the child's spiritual companion. Those born on days associated with jaguars would have jaguar Nahuales, fierce and powerful, predisposed toward leadership and combat. Children born under eagle signs received eagle Nahuales, granting them vision and connection to celestial forces. Snake days produced serpent Nahuales, associated with transformation and earth powers. Dogs, coyotes, deer, butterflies, lizards, and countless other creatures served as Nahuales, each bringing specific qualities and destinies to the humans they accompanied. The animal was not chosen, but assigned by cosmic forces beyond human control, a fate written into the calendar itself and unalterable once established. The relationship between person and Nahual was not abstract but tangible, with real consequences that could be observed and verified. If someone's Nahual was injured in the forest, that person would develop corresponding wounds or illness without any apparent physical cause. If a hunter killed a jaguar, somewhere a person with jaguar Nahual might die suddenly, their life force extinguished when their animal double perished. This connection meant that individuals had to protect not only their own physical bodies, but also their animal companions, had to live with the constant awareness that their fate was tied to creatures they might never see or meet. Parents would teach children to honor and respect the animal that served as their Nahual, to avoid hunting or eating that particular species, to recognize that their own survival depended on the survival of creatures in the wild. This belief created a complex relationship with the natural world, where every animal might potentially be someone's Nahual, and killing carried risks beyond the merely physical. But the Nahual concept extended beyond this basic spiritual companionship into the realm of active transformation and sorcery. Certain individuals, through rigorous training and innate ability, could learn to deliberately transform into their Nahual form, assuming animal shape and walking through the world with animal senses and abilities. These Nahuali, as the human shapeshifters were called, occupied a position of both respect and fear in Aztec society. They were powerful sorcerers, capable of traveling great distances in animal form, of spying on enemies, of healing or harming through their supernatural abilities. Some used their powers for protection and healing, serving their communities as spiritual warriors who fought malevolent forces on behalf of ordinary people. Others turned to malicious purposes, transforming into animal form to steal, to attack, to cause sickness and misfortune to those who had offended them. The process of becoming a Nahuali required years of training under a master sorcerer who possessed the knowledge of transformation. Initiates learned to enter altered states of consciousness through fasting, through ingestion of sacred plants, including peyote and morning glory seeds, through meditation and ritual practices that weakened the boundaries between human and animal consciousness. They studied the movements and behaviors of their Nahual animals, learned to think and perceive as the creatures did, gradually merging their human awareness with animal instinct, until the distinction between the two became blurred enough to permit full transformation. The actual moment of shapeshifting was described in various accounts as both terrifying and ecstatic. A dissolution of human form accompanied by the emergence of fur or feathers or scales, the reshaping of bones and muscles, the sudden rush of animal senses far more acute than human perception. Those who achieved transformation described it as simultaneously becoming something other and becoming more fully themselves, accessing aspects of that human form constrained and limited. Stories of Nahuali circulated widely in Aztec society and persisted long after the conquest, woven into the fabric of Mexican folklore where they remain alive today. Tales told of sorcerers who transformed into owls to fly through darkness and witness events far away, of warriors who became jaguars to hunt enemy forces with supernatural stealth, of healers who took the forms of hummingbirds to travel to the land of the dead and retrieve lost souls. Other stories carried darker tones, accounts of malevolent Nahuali who assumed coyote or snake form to attack livestock or poison wells, who used their powers for theft and murder, who served as mercenaries for those willing to pay for supernatural violence. Communities developed methods for identifying and defending against malicious Nahuali, protective rituals and amulets designed to reveal or ward off shapeshifters who might be operating nearby. The accusation of being a Nahuali could bring severe consequences, including exile or execution, though proving such charges was notoriously difficult given the secretive of the practice. The belief in Nahualism reveals profound aspects of Aztec psychology and philosophy that distinguish their worldview from European traditions. Where Western thought emphasized fixed categories and clear boundaries between human and animal, rational and irrational, civilization and huang, the Mexica embraced fluidity and transformation as fundamental features of reality. The Nahual concept suggested that every person contained multitudes, that identity was not singular but composite, that the self extended beyond the physical body into animal realm and spiritual dimension. This understanding permitted a relationship with the natural world based on kinship rather than domination, on recognition of shared consciousness rather than hierarchical separation. When a Mexica individual looked at an animal, they saw not a lesser creature but a potential relative, perhaps literally their spiritual double or the Nahual of someone they knew. This perception created ethical obligations toward animals that transcended practical considerations of utility or survival. Modern anthropologists and psychologists have found in Nahualism fascinating parallels to concepts of the shadow self, the unconscious mind, the recognition that human consciousness contains aspects that civilized society represses or denies. The animal Nahual might represent those instinctual, intuitive, physical aspects of human that rational thought seeks to control or transcend. The shapeshifter, who deliberately transforms into animal form, might symbolize the psychological work of integrating suppressed elements of personality, accessing buried power and wisdom that purely rational consciousness cannot reach. Jung's concept of archetypes and collective unconscious finds unexpected resonance in Aztec Nahualism, suggesting that different cultures developed similar insights about human psychology through vastly different mythological and spiritual frameworks. The Nahual becomes not primitive superstition, but sophisticated understanding of human complexity, coded in mythological language, but addressing genuine psychological realities. In contemporary Mexico, belief in Nahuales persists in rural communities and indigenous populations who maintain connection to pre-Columbian spiritual traditions. Curanderos and shamans still claim the ability to transform or communicate with animal spirits, to diagnose illness by consulting Nahual companions, to heal through accessing the power of shape-shifting consciousness. Urban Mexicans who dismiss such beliefs as superstition may still feel uncomfortable killing certain animals, may experience unexplained connection to specific creatures, may recognize in themselves the echo of ancient understanding that the boundary between human and animal is thinner than modern materialism suggests. The Nagual has entered popular culture through literature and film, becoming a recognizable figure in magical realism and contemporary fantasy, though often stripped of the deep cosmological significance it held in Aztec thought. Carlos Castaneda's controversial books, whatever their factual accuracy, introduced millions to concepts derived from Nahualism, sparking renewed interest in indigenous American spirituality and shape-shifting traditions. The Nahual teaches that transformation is possible, that identity is not prison but possibility, that the limitations we accept as fixed might be conventions rather than cosmic laws. It suggests that to be fully human might require acknowledging and integrating our animal rather than transcending or denying it, that wisdom comes from multiple forms of consciousness working together rather than from purely rational thought dominating all other modes of perception. The Mexica who understood themselves as walking through the world, accompanied by invisible animal companions, who knew that their fates were bound to creatures in the forest or sky or water, who believed that transformation between forms was not impossible but difficult, lived in a cosmos far richer and stranger than the one modern materialism describes. Their world contained depths and connections that empirical struggles to measure or validate, but that experiential reality continues to suggest might be true in ways that transcend simple verification. The Nahual remains, half hidden in shadows, waiting for those willing to look beyond the surface of things and recognize that every human carries within them not just consciousness, but a companion who walks on four legs, or flies on wings, or slithers through grass. A double whose existence makes us more than we appear to be, and whose fate reminds us that we are never truly alone. We have journeyed together through the shadows of Tenochtitlan, descended into the 9 levels of Mictlan, confronted skeletal goddesses waiting at the edges of reality, and witnessed the birth of the 5th sun from flames of sacrifice. We have met gods who demanded blood, creatures who lurked in rivers, spirits who haunted crossroads, and shamans who transformed into animal forms. But if you believe these stories belong only to the past, safely contained within history books and museum displays, then you have missed the most important truth of all. The mythology of the Aztecs did not die when Tenochtitlan fell, did not vanish when Spanish priests burned the codices and demolished the temples. It transformed, adapted, hid itself within new forms and new names, and continues to live in the beliefs and practices of millions of people who walk the streets of modern Mexico and beyond. The gods still speak, though often in whispers, and those who know how to listen can hear the ancient rhythms pulsing beneath the surface of contemporary culture. Walk through any Mexican town or city on the first 2 days of November, and you will witness the most visible manifestation of Aztec cosmology's persistence. Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, fills streets with marigold flowers, sugar skulls, elaborate altars laden with food and photographs, families gathering in cemeteries to clean graves and commune with departed loved ones. The Catholic Church claims this celebration as All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, Christian holidays imported from Europe. But the indigenous roots run far deeper, connecting directly to the Aztec understanding that death is not an ending, but a transformation, that the boundary between the living and the dead is permeable, that the departed remain in relationship with those who continue breathing. The ofrendas, those altars built in homes and public spaces, echo the offerings once made to Mictlantecutli and Mictecacihuatl. The belief that spirits return on specific calendar days mirrors the descents of the Cihuateteo and other supernatural beings according to the sacred calendar. The skeleton imagery that decorates every surface, those grinning calaveras dressed in fancy clothing, carries the genetic code of the Tzitzimime and other skeletal deities who embodied the truth that death walks always among the living. The persistence of beliefs about Nahuales reveals another layer of continuity between ancient and modern. In rural communities throughout Mexico and Central America, people still speak of shapeshifters, of individuals who can transform into animal forms, of spiritual connections between humans and specific creatures. Curanderos and traditional healers incorporate Nahual concepts into their diagnostic and healing practices, identifying a patient's animal companion and addressing spiritual imbalances that affect both human and animal aspects of the self. Urban Mexicans who consider themselves modern and rational may still feel uncomfortable killing certain animals, may experience unexplained affinity for specific creatures, may recognize in themselves echoes of the old understanding that identity extends beyond human flesh. The Nahual has entered global popular culture through literature, film, and spiritual movements, introducing millions worldwide to indigenous American concepts of transformation and multiplicity of self. What the Mexica understood through direct spiritual experience, contemporary psychology approaches through theories of archetypes and unconscious mind. Different languages describing similar truths about human complexity. The weeping woman who haunts rivers and waterways, La Llorona, carries within her legend the unmistakable DNA of Cihuacoatl. The white dress, the nocturnal wailing, the association with crossroads and liminal spaces, the prophecy of doom for those who hear her cries, all these elements existed in pre-Columbian mythology long before Spanish colonization added Christian morality tales about sin and punishment. La Llorona has become perhaps the most famous ghost story in Latin American culture, told to children as cautionary tale, featured in countless films and books, reported as genuine encounter by people who swear they heard her cries in darkness. She is Cihuacoatl, wearing a mask acceptable to Catholic authorities, the serpent woman who survived by adopting new narrative while maintaining essential. Her persistence demonstrates that mythology adapts to changing circumstances, that gods and spirits do not simply disappear when their temples fall, but find new forms through which to manifest and new stories through which to communicate timeless truths. The practices surrounding death and mourning in Mexican culture reveal Aztec cosmology's continued influence even among people who have never heard of Mictlan or the 9 trials souls must endure. The elaborate funeral rituals, the specific timing of memorial ceremonies, the offerings made to the dead at prescribed intervals, all echo the ancient understanding that death is a process rather than an instantaneous event, that souls journey through stages of transformation, that the living maintain obligations to the deceased. The custom of placing food and drink with the dead, of leaving possessions in graves, of making periodic offerings at specific calendar intervals, directly parallels Aztec practices designed to sustain souls during their 4-year journey through the underworld. The respect shown to human remains, the care taken in burial and memorial, the understanding that bodies are sacred even after life departs, reflects the Mexica recognition that physical form carries spiritual significance beyond mere biological function. Contemporary Mexican spirituality, even when explicitly Christian, contains layers of pre-Columbian belief that create unique syncretic forms found nowhere else in the Catholic world. The Virgin of Guadalupe, Mexico's most beloved religious figure, appeared on the hill of Tepeyac, where the goddess Tonantzin had been worshipped for centuries. Her image incorporates indigenous symbolism, Her cult center occupies the same location as ancient temples. Her role in Mexican spirituality closely parallels the maternal earth goddesses of Aztec pantheon. This is not accidental syncretism, but deliberate preservation. Indigenous people maintaining connection to their spiritual heritage by encoding it within forms acceptable to colonial authorities. Churches built on pyramid foundations, Christian saints associated with specific indigenous deities, Catholic feast days aligned with agricultural cycles that predate Spanish arrival by millennia, all demonstrate the sophisticated strategies through which native beliefs survived and flourished despite systematic attempts to erase them. The ancient understanding of sacrifice, though no longer expressed through human hearts offered on temple altars, continues in transformed manifestations throughout Mexican culture. The concept that creation requires destruction, that renewal demands sacrifice, that beauty emerges from suffering, pervades Mexican art, literature, philosophy, and daily life. The willingness to endure hardship for family or community, the acceptance of suffering as meaningful rather than simply tragic. The recognition that easy comfort often comes at unacceptable cost. These values trace directly to Aztec cosmology's central teachings. The celebration of martyrs and revolutionary heroes who gave their lives for causes larger than themselves reflects the old understanding that sacrifice confers sacred status, that those who die for the community achieve a form of immortality. Even the aesthetic appreciation for images of death and decay, the Mexican comfort with mortality that shocks cultures attempting to deny death's reality, demonstrates continuity with ancestors who carved skulls on every temple and understood that acknowledging death was prerequisite for fully living. What can these ancient myths teach modern civilization struggling with ecological crisis, social fragmentation, and loss of meaning? The Aztec understanding that humans exist in reciprocal relationship with natural world, that taking requires giving, that existence depends on maintaining balance between opposing forces, offers wisdom desperately needed in an age of extraction and exploitation. Their recognition that the cosmos is fragile, that order requires constant maintenance, that destruction always threatens at the edges of creation, speaks to contemporary awareness that civilization rests on precarious foundations and cannot be taken for granted. Their comfort with paradox and multiplicity, their acceptance that truth contains contradictions and identity is fluid rather than fixed, provides alternative to binary thinking that oversimplifies complex realities. Their integration of death into life, their refusal to deny mortality or pretend that avoiding the subject makes it less real, offers healthier relationship with the one certainty all humans share. As we conclude this journey through the hidden corners of Aztec mythology, as we emerge from the shadows where gods and monsters wait, carrying with us the knowledge of secrets long buried and truths long denied, remember that these stories are not dead relics, but living traditions. They pulse beneath the surface of modern culture. They whisper from ancient stones still standing in Mexico City's heart. They echo in the practices of millions who honor the dead and recognize that the boundary between past and present is as permeable as the boundary between life and death. The Mexica understood something that contemporary culture often forgets, that forgetting where you came from means losing understanding of where you are going, that severing connection to ancestral wisdom leaves you unmoored and directionless, that the past speaks to the present in languages that must be learned if future is to have meaning. If this exploration has awakened your curiosity about the histories they never taught you, the mythologies they tried to erase, the truths that hide in shadows waiting to be discovered, then subscribe to Boring Bedtime Stories and continue this journey with us. There are countless other secrets waiting, other gods whose names have been forgotten, other cosmologies that challenge everything you thought you knew. The whispers from Tenochtitlan's shadows are only the beginning, and those brave enough to listen will find that the ancient world has never been more relevant, more necessary, or more alive than it is in this moment when humanity stands at a crossroads and must choose which path leads toward wisdom and which toward forgetting.